They called her the kingdom's greatest strength. Then he made her kneel. One night, one act of public cruelty dressed up as politics. And the woman who held this empire together with her bare hands, who bled for its borders, mourned its dead, fed its hungry, was forced to bow before the woman sent to replace her. He thought she'd beg. He thought she'd break. She did neither. By sunrise, Maelys Thorn was gone, and the kingdom began to die without her. Stay with me until the end. Like this, drop your city in the comments, and let's begin. The throne room of Asheville had been built to make men feel small. That was the point. Maelys had always understood. The black-veined marble floor stretched 40 feet from the entrance to the dais, and every inch of that distance was designed to be walked slowly, under the weight of 1,000 watching eyes. The ceilings arched so high that torchlight died before reaching them, leaving the upper dark untouched, like a wound the palace had learned to live with. The banners of House Draven hung floor to ceiling on both walls. Obsidian wolves on blood-red silk, their jaws open, their eyes stitched in gold thread that caught the firelight and seemed to move. Maelys had walked this room 100 times. She had never once felt it trying to break her. Until tonight. She stood at the far end of the entrance corridor, just outside the great doors, and she listened. Inside, the court was already assembled. She could hear the low murmur of it, voices layered over voices, the clink of goblets, the rustle of formal dress. 300 alphas, nobles, pack elders, and court officials from every corner of the Draven Empire gathered at Kaelin's command. The invitation had gone out under the seal of a celebration of alliance. No further detail. That alone should have told her something. It hadn't. She had dressed carefully, not because she was naive. She had learned long ago that the presentation of calm was its own form of armor, but because she had told herself that Kaelin would not do this. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Whatever the last 3 months had been, whatever distance had opened between them, whatever cold silences had replaced the conversations they used to have until the fires burned down to ash, she had told herself there was still a floor. A limit. Something he would not cross. Her gown was deep blue, the color of the sky an hour before full dark. The fabric was heavy and unadorned, no embroidery, no jewels except for the silver Luna crest that rested at the base of her throat on a slender chain, the mark of her bond, forged on the day Kaelin's wolf had recognized hers. She had not worn it to make a statement. She had worn it the way she always wore it, because for 3 years it had simply been part of her body. Her hair was pinned back. Her hands were still. The doors opened. The noise of the court did not stop when she entered. It shifted. It bent around her like water around a stone. Heads turned. Conversations faltered mid-sentence and then resumed at a lower pitch, the kind of pitch people used when they were talking about what they were looking at. Maelys walked the 40 feet of marble at an even pace, her chin level, her eyes moving through the crowd, without landing on anyone long enough to seem afraid. She had learned that too. Fear was a smell. You couldn't always control the feeling, but you could control the smell. Kaelin was on the throne. He was always at his most dangerous when he was at his most composed. That was the thing about him that had taken her the longest to understand. That the coldness wasn't absence of feeling, it was control of it. Total and deliberate, a fist closed so tightly around the inside of himself that nothing got in or out without his permission. He sat with his shoulders back and his jaw set, dressed in the formal black of House Draven, the crown on his head. Not the war crown, the iron one with the wolf's head snarling at the front, but the court crown, silver and sharp-angled, the one he wore when he needed to look like a king rather than a soldier. He watched her walk toward him with his wolf-gray eyes, and he did not stand. That was the first thing that was wrong. He always stood when she entered a room. It was not protocol. Nothing in Draven law required it. It was simply what he did, had always done. From the first night after their bond ceremony, when she had come back from the healer's wing with her wrist wrapped and he had gotten to his feet before she reached the doorway. She had never asked him about it. She hadn't needed to. He did not stand. She stopped at the base of the dais and held his gaze. Around her, the court had gone entirely quiet. 300 people, and the room had the quality of held breath. Kaelin, her voice came out even. She was proud of that. Maelys. He said her name the way he might name a territory on a map, precisely, without warmth. Something moved at the edge of her vision. She turned her head slightly, just slightly, because she would not give the room the satisfaction of a flinch, and she saw her for the first time in person. Lady Selene Varick was standing at the right side of the throne, one step down from Kaylin's seat, positioned with the precision of someone who had rehearsed where to stand. She was tall, fine-boned, dressed in white and gold that had clearly been chosen to contrast with the room's existing darkness. Her hair was dark and arranged in elaborate coils. Her face was the kind of beautiful that knew it was being looked at and had learned to perform accordingly. The slight tilt of the head, the expression that read as serene from a distance and something else up close. She was watching Milas with the specific attentiveness of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular moment to arrive. Milas had heard the name Selene Varick for 8 months. She had heard it the way you hear thunder. At a distance first, a rumble you can dismiss, then close enough to know it was heading for you. Lady Selene, eldest daughter of Lord Commander Varick of the Eastern Reach. Lady Selene, who had attended 3 of Kaylin's military councils in the past year. Lady Selene, who was said to have her father's gift for strategy and her mother's gift for knowing which room she needed to be in. What Milas had not been told, what no one had told her, was why Selene Varick was standing on the dais of Ashvale's throne room tonight. She looked back at Kaylin. "What is this?" she asked. Just that. Not an accusation. A question, clean and direct. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "The Eastern Reach has agreed to a full military alliance. Lord Commander Varick's forces will integrate with ours along the northern and eastern borders. It ends 15 years of negotiated neutrality." He paused. "The terms were finalized this morning." "I know what an alliance is." Her voice stayed flat. "I asked what this is." Kaylin stood. Not for her. He stood the way a king stands when he is about to make an announcement, deliberate, formal, the weight of the moment sitting on him visibly. He descended the dais steps slowly and stopped at the level below where Selene stood, and then he turned and extended his hand backward without looking at Selene, and Selene placed her hand in his with the ease of someone who had done it before. The court exhaled. Milas did not. "In accordance with the treaty terms agreed to by House Draven and House Varick," Kaylin said, and his voice carried to every corner of the room without him raising it, "and in recognition of the strategic importance of a unified leadership bond between our houses." He paused, and in that pause something terrible finished building in the room. "I will take Selene Varick as my queen." The noise that followed was not applause. It was not silence either. It was the specific sound of 300 people processing something at different speeds. Some already had known. Milas could see it in their faces, the way certain eyes had been watching her specifically since she walked in, waiting for exactly this moment. Others were genuinely startled, and their startlement had the slightly gratified quality of people who witness catastrophe from a safe distance. A few, the pack elders, the older alphas, looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been calculation, because in a room full of political animals, pity and calculation tend to wear the same expression. Milas stood very still. She was aware of her breathing. She was aware of the Luna crest at her throat, its weight suddenly precise against her collarbone. She was aware of Kaylin, who had looked away from her the moment he finished speaking, his eyes moving to the crowd with the practiced sweep of a man receiving the room's reaction, managing it. He was not looking at her because he did not need to. She was a detail he had accounted for, and the accounting was already done. She could feel her wolf, somewhere in the deep interior of herself, pressing against the inside of her chest like a fist. Not with rage. The rage would come later, maybe, or maybe never, because she had learned that what felt like rage in the first moment sometimes turned out to be grief wearing the wrong coat. What she felt from her wolf right now was more primitive than rage. It was recognition, the kind your body arrives at before your mind does. The understanding that something has changed in the world and that the change is permanent and that no amount of stillness in your face will prevent it from being true. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. Kaylin descended the remaining steps to the floor and turned to face her, and now he looked at her, and she wished he hadn't, because what she saw in his face was worse than cruelty. Cruelty would have meant feeling. What she saw was resolution. The expression of a man who had made a decision so completely that the emotions attending it had been compressed into something unreachable, and who was now simply executing what he had already decided in the private hours when she wasn't there. Melis, his voice was even. As the terms of this alliance require a clear ceremonial recognition of Celine's standing. Don't, she said. The word came out quiet enough that only the front rows heard it, but Kaelin heard it. She saw his jaw tighten fractionally, the only crack in the surface. He continued, I ask that you formally acknowledge her position. His eyes held hers. Before the court. The room was absolutely silent now. Melis understood what he was asking. It wasn't merely an acknowledgement. A verbal acknowledgement could be spun 100 ways, dismissed as diplomatic courtesy, explained as procedural formality. What he was asking, with 300 witnesses, was for her to kneel. That was the Draven ceremony of acknowledgement. It had been used 3 times in the dynasty's history, always to mark the formal transference of a title from one person to another. You did not acknowledge a queen of Asheville by shaking her hand. You bent your knee and you stayed bent until she gave you leave to rise, and in the staying, everyone in the room understood exactly who held the higher position. He was asking her to kneel before the woman he was replacing her with. In the room she had run as Luna for 3 years, in front of every alpha in the Empire. She stood there and she thought, with the strange clarity that descends on people at the worst possible moments, about the morning 6 months ago when the northern border camp at Grayfen had collapsed in the early freeze. Kaelin had been 3 days' ride south, meeting with the Varric advisors. She had not known that then, had only known he was unavailable. She had taken 7 of the palace guard, ridden through the night, organized the emergency shelters herself, spent 36 hours in temperatures that left her with frostbite on 2 fingers of her left hand that still ached in cold weather. She thought about the pack at Terath's Edge, where the grain stores had burned and she had redirected palace provisions for 3 months until the new harvest came in, quietly, without any formal decree, because she had learned that formal decrees required council approval. And council approval required time and time was something the people at Terath's Edge didn't have. She thought about the 17 political alliances she had personally maintained with letters, with meetings, with the long and unglamorous work of making people feel seen by their ruling house, which was not something Kaelin had ever been particularly gifted at, and which she had never, not once, been formally credited for. She thought about all of that, and then she thought, he knows. That was the part that didn't make sense, and then it made exact sense. Kaelin knew every line on that ledger. He had never said so explicitly, but she had seen it in the way he watched her work. A certain attention, not quite pride, not quite gratitude, something more complicated than either. The look of a man who understood exactly what he was benefiting from. And he was doing this anyway. Which meant the calculation had changed, or the calculation had always included this, and she had been the last to understand it. She looked past Kaelin at Selene Varric, still positioned on the dais step with her hands clasped in front of her, and her chin up and her eyes on Melis. Selena's expression was perfectly calibrated. Not gloating, not quite, because gloating in a room this size would be a political error, and Selene Varric did not make those. But there was something in the set of her mouth, a satisfaction contained so precisely that you could see exactly how much effort the containing required. This was Celine's room tonight. Melis looked back at Kaelin. "You're serious," she said. "Yes. This is what you want from me. Tonight. Here. The ceremony requires... I know what the ceremony requires." Her voice was still low, still even. She hated herself slightly for how even it was, and then she didn't hate herself for it, because her evenness was not performance. It was simply what she had. The only thing in this room that actually belonged to her. "I'm asking if this is what you want." Something shifted in his face, gone in an instant. "It's what the Alliance requires." "That's not what I asked." His jaw was tight now. "Maelis, answer me." She said it quietly. "One time. Is this what you want?" The silence stretched. Around them, 300 people held very still, the way a crowd holds still when it senses that the thing they came to witness is actually happening. Kaylin said, "Yes." She had thought. She realized in that moment that she had thought he would hesitate. That was the thing she had been counting on without knowing she was counting on it. That when it came to the actual moment, there would be a hesitation. Some small tremor in the surface, some evidence that what they had been to each other existed somewhere in him still. Not enough to change the outcome. She wasn't naive, but enough to know it cost him something. There was no hesitation. "Yes," he said, as flat and certain as stone. She breathed in, out. She looked at the floor. Then she bent her knee and knelt. She did not look at Celine. She looked at the black-veined marble between her hands, and she stayed very still. And she waited for the woman above her to say the word that would give her leave to rise, and she thought of nothing. She was very deliberate about thinking of nothing. There was a skill to this, the same skill that got you through the night of the Greyfen collapse, when 2 people died despite your best effort, the same skill that got you through the council meetings, where you were talked over and then thanked for your input, and the input was never used. You simply stopped. You became the floor. You let the moment move over you the way water moves over stone, and you stayed still, and you survived it. Celine let her kneel for a long time. That was intentional, and every person in the room understood that it was intentional. The ceremony did not specify a duration. Celine could give the word the moment Melis's knee touched the floor. She chose not to. She let it run. 10 seconds, 15, 20. And the silence in the room took on a particular quality during that wait, a quality Melis could feel on the back of her neck. Some of the watchers were uncomfortable. Others were recording it in their memories with an avidity that said something true about them. "Rise," Celine said. Melis rose. She stood straight and did not touch her dress or her hair. She looked at Celine once, briefly, and Celine looked back at her with those precisely calibrated eyes. And then Melis turned and walked back across the 40 feet of marble to the entrance of the throne room, and the crowd parted for her. And she walked through the gap without looking at anyone, and the great doors swung open ahead of her, and she passed through them, and they closed behind her. She stood in the corridor outside. The stone was cool under her hands when she pressed them flat against the wall. Her breathing was fine. Her face was dry. She checked both of these things methodically, the way you check a wound site. Not because she expected to find disaster, but because she had learned never to assume. Breathing, fine. Face, dry. Luna crest, still there, still warm at her throat. She stood in the corridor for exactly 4 breaths, and then she started walking. Not back to the royal chambers. She didn't consciously decide this. Her feet simply did not turn in that direction. She walked the corridor past the Great Hall, past the gallery of Draven portraits, where dead kings watched her from within their frames with eyes that had been painted to seem alive, past the east staircase and the guard post at the second landing, and the small alcove where she had once sat for 3 hours talking with the old pack elder from Ferris Hollow, who had come to court with a border dispute no one would hear and whom she had listened to until he wept, simply because no one else had. She walked until she reached the wolf yard. It was empty at this hour. The training wolves were stabled. The great hunting wolves that ran the perimeter were out on their routes. The yard was bare-packed earth and wooden posts and the smell of animals that had been there recently. A warm, honest smell of muscle and dirt and breath that Melis had always found easier than the smell of the palace. All formal scent and politics, and something underneath that she had never managed to name. Some combination of stone and old power and the specific anxiety of people who spent their lives being watched. She walked to the center of the yard and stood there. The night was clear. No moon yet. It was still early. But the stars were out in force, the great sprawl of them across the sky that she had grown up under in the hill territories before Kylan's wolf had found hers, before she had ever imagined herself standing in this yard in this palace. She did not cry. She was aware of the possibility of it. It was there, the pressure of it, somewhere behind her breastbone, enormous and careful, the way large things are careful when they move through small spaces. But crying was not something she could afford in the wolf yard of Ashvale Palace on the night Kaelin Draven had publicly replaced her, because the yard had walls, and walls had ears, and she was not done yet with tonight, not by a long way. What she did instead was think. She thought about what she had just done. Not with self-pity. She was meticulous about keeping self-pity out of her internal accounting. It was the most useless expenditure there was, but practically. She turned the event in her mind the way you turn a stone to examine all its surfaces. She knelt. She rose. She left. She had not begged, had not accused, had not wept, had not said anything that could be quoted back at her in a council chamber as evidence of instability or grievance. She had given them exactly one clear, unambiguous action that everyone in the room had seen and that everyone would interpret correctly. She had complied, and that was the problem. Compliance would be read by everyone who had watched it as acceptance. That was how these things worked. The symbol of the ceremony had a meaning, and the meaning, once performed, belonged to everyone who witnessed it. She had meant it as survival, as the decision you make when the options are limited and the audience is real, and the consequences of public breakdown are worse than the consequences of public dignity. But meaning was not what the room would record. The room would record. She knelt. She acknowledged Celine. She accepted the situation. She had not accepted the situation. But there was no ritual for that. No ceremony for, I am kneeling because I have no other option right now. But I want you to understand that this is not surrender. It is strategy. It is the decision of someone who intends to be alive tomorrow. She pressed her hands against her thighs and felt the roughness of the gown's fabric and thought, then be alive tomorrow. Be alive tomorrow and figure out the rest from there. Inside the palace, she could hear the celebration beginning, muffled by distance and stone, but unmistakable, so the shift in the quality of noise that happened when an event moved from ceremony to feast, when the formality broke open and what came out was relief and social performance, and the particular loudness of people who wanted to demonstrate that they were having a good time. She stood in the wolf yard and listened to the sound of 300 people celebrating what had just been done to her, and she let herself feel the specific thing she had been holding back since the moment Kaylin's voice came out flat and certain on the word yes. And the thing was not grief exactly, and not rage exactly, and not humiliation, though it had surfaces of all of those. The thing was, she was done. She recognized it the way you recognize the moment a fire goes out. Not a decision, not even a feeling, more like a physical change in state. Something that had been burning for 3 years, through difficulty and distance and the slow erosion of a bond that had started as a living thing and had been gradually replaced by its own outline. Something went out. Quietly, without announcement. She was done. She did not leave the wolf yard immediately. There were still people moving through the palace corridors, and the fastest way to ensure her intentions became someone else's information was to appear to be going somewhere with purpose when there were eyes to see her. She sat on the ground with her back against one of the training posts, and she let the night pass over her, the cold air coming down off the highlands to the north, the smell of the stabled wolves drifting from the enclosure. The sounds of the palace gradually changing shape as the feast wore on and people ate and drank and said the things people say when they are with others and want to be heard being on the right side of history. Around the time the noise peaked and began to ease, she went back inside. She moved through the back corridors. She had learned the palace's internal geography the way she learned everything about this place, systematically, because knowledge of where you were was the foundation of knowing how to move in it. She went up the staff stairs to the 3rd floor, past the storage rooms, through the private passage that connected to the royal wing's side entrance. She walked into the chambers she had occupied for 3 years. They still looked like hers. Everything was in its place. The books stacked by the window, the writing table with its correspondence organized by territory and urgency. The pair of boots by the door that she had worn to the Greyfen camp and had never found quite the right time to have resoled. The wardrobe, the small iron chest where she kept letters from the pack settlements she'd assisted, the training map pinned to the wall showing the frontier territories she'd been tracking for the past season. She looked at the Luna crest at her throat one more time. Then she unclipped the chain and set it on the writing table. Not with violence, not with ceremony. She set it down the way you set down something you've carried a long distance, when you've finally reached the place where you're allowed to put it down. She changed out of the blue gown into riding clothes. A plain dark shirt, heavy trousers, her second pair of boots, a traveling cloak with a hood. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done emergency packing before, Because she had, more than once, in the years before Kalen, when the hill territories had their own particular instabilities. She took what she needed: the emergency coin pouch from the bottom of the iron chest, the frontier map, the thin leather pack she kept rolled behind the wardrobe. She took none of the correspondence. She took none of the Luna tokens, the formal markers of her position, the letters of authority with the Draven seal. She thought about that deliberately and chose to leave them, because taking them would have constituted theft of kingdom resources, and she was not going to leave this place as a thief. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. She was 27 years old. She had come to this palace at 24 with a bond mark on her wrist and a wolf who trusted the man whose wolf had called to hers, and she had worked for 3 years with everything she had to become something real, in a role that the court had never fully decided whether to respect or resent. She had survived council politics and border crises and the particular loneliness of being bonded to someone who was constitutionally incapable of showing weakness, which meant he was also often constitutionally incapable of being present. She had made the frontier packs real to the palace and the palace real to the frontier packs. She had learned every name she could and remembered it. She had done the unglamorous work without expecting to be thanked. And tonight, Kalen Draven had asked her to kneel. She pulled the hood up and walked to the door. The back passage, the staff stairs, the lower corridor, the south entrance where the night guards changed at the third bell, and there was a 12-minute window before the new guard settled in. She had noted that pattern 8 months ago for no reason she could have articulated at the time, the way you note certain things when some part of you has begun to prepare for a possibility your conscious mind hasn't admitted to yet. The night air hit her face. She walked into it. The city of Ashvale spread south and east from the palace walls, and at this hour the outer districts were mostly dark. Shops shuttered, households sleeping, the late market vendors packing up their stalls. She moved through the shadows of the outer ward, past the grain storehouses, past the stable district with its smell of animals and fresh hay, and she let herself remember every piece of this place that had been hers too, in the way that a place becomes yours when you pour work into it, not legally, not by bloodline or title, but by the accumulation of presence, of caring, of choosing it every day when you had choices. She remembered it, and she kept walking. At the east gate, the guard knew her face. That was a risk she had calculated. She had her hood up, and her posture changed. Not a trick, not deception, simply a different way of carrying herself. A narrowing down, the removal of the Luna-bearing uprightness that the court had come to associate with her. She was unremarkable at the east gate, a traveler, possibly a returning merchant. She passed through on the pretext of a documented late transit. She had a general-use court pass, a functional document that didn't specify holder identity, that she had kept in the iron chest for 3 years without ever having a reason to use it. She used it now. The gate guard barely glanced at it. People leaving the city at the late bell were people with reasons for leaving, and reasons were the guard's problem only when they had to be. She walked out of Asheville and onto the northern road, and she did not look back. The road north climbed toward the Highland Ridge in the first hour, and she climbed with it, her body falling into the long ground-eating stride she had developed in the hill territories, the gait of someone who knows they are going to be walking for a long time and has made a structural peace with that fact. The cold came down off the highlands in earnest now, and she was glad of the cloak, glad of the boots, glad of the hours she had spent in the wolf yard and the training rooms maintaining a body that was capable of doing what she was asking it to do. By the first hour, the lights of Ashevale were already reduced to a glow on the horizon behind her. By the second hour, they were gone entirely. She was in the open dark of the Highland Road, and the stars were out in force, and there was no one in front of her and no one behind her, and the only sound was the wind in the grasses at the road's edge and her own feet on the packed earth. She breathed in the clean, dark air. Somewhere in the palace behind her, the celebration was still happening. Kalen was still on his throne. Celine Varick was at his right hand. 300 people were raising glasses to the health of the new queen and to the alliance that had produced her, and perhaps some small number of them were thinking about Maelys Thorne, and perhaps not, and perhaps it didn't matter because she was already outside the walls and getting farther from them with every step. She thought about what came next. Not with plan. She was too early in this for plan, still too close to the bone of it, and the worst decisions were the ones made before the immediate heat had burned through. But she thought about direction. The frontier. The outer pack settlements she had corresponded with, the ones that existed in the margins of the Empire's official attention, the ones she knew by name because she had done the work of knowing them. There was enough coin in the pouch for 2 weeks at careful expenditure. There was the map. There was a body that worked, and a mind that was, in its current stripped-down state, unusually clear. She had been the Luna of the Draven Empire, and tonight that ended. She had been Kaelin Draven's bonded mate, and tonight that ended. What she was now, in the dark of the Highland Road with the city behind her and the frontier ahead, was simply herself. Malus Thorn, 27 years old, with a wolf that was pressing its nose to the inside of her chest like a dog checking on a sleeping child. Alert, watchful, not panicked, waiting to see what she would do. She walked faster. The ridge crested at the 4th hour, and she stood at its top for a moment to look at the sky, which had expanded enormously now that she was above the tree line, the stars massive and indifferent, and full of the comfort that large impersonal things sometimes provide. She had stood at ridge tops in the hill territories as a girl and looked at the same sky and felt exactly this particular combination of smallness and possibility, and she recognized it now like an old note sounding in a register she hadn't heard in a long time. She started down the other side. She was 3 hours into the highland when she heard the wolf. Not her wolf. Her wolf was internal, carried her, was her in the animal sense that bonded wolves are part of their person. This was external. A wolf call, rising from somewhere in the dark trees to the west of the road. A sound she didn't recognize. Not any pack she knew by its call signature, but also not aggressive. Not the challenge call, not the alarm call. Something else. Inquiry. The vocalization of a wolf who has caught a scent they are not sure about and is asking the dark for information. She stopped and stood still. The call came again. Closer this time. Accompanied now by a second voice, lower, somewhere in the trees north of the first. Her wolf stirred. She reached into her cloak for the short blade she always carried. Not a weapon of offense, more a tool, the kind of blade useful for camp tasks and for the moments when you needed to make a decision quickly and couldn't afford to be unarmed. She held it loose in her hand and stood in the road and waited. The third call was different. It came from directly ahead of her on the road, which meant something had moved through the trees faster than she had tracked it, which meant this was a coordinated approach, which meant these were not random wolves stumbling across a traveler's scent. These were pack wolves operating in formation. The shape that came out of the dark was huge. It resolved into a man, or a man-adjacent thing, still mid-shift, the form not fully committed to either state, which was the most dangerous configuration because it had the speed of the wolf in the hands of the man, and the decision-making was somewhere in between. He was broad across the shoulders, dressed in the rough hide and cloth common to the frontier packs, and his eyes in the dark were the luminous gold of a wolf who was close to the surface. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're Malus Thorn," he said. His voice was rough with the half shift, but his diction was controlled. Not a raider, not a stray. Someone who knew what they were doing and had been sent to do a specific thing. "Who's asking?" she said. "Fenvaris. Pack Outer Crave." He paused. "We've been tracking you since the second ridge." He tilted his head slightly, the way wolves do when they are reading a scent with care. "You're not running scared," he said. "You're running chosen." She didn't confirm or deny it. "There's a difference," he said. "We know the difference." In the trees to either side, she could hear the others. 4, 5, she didn't have a count yet. Moving, settling, the specific quality of stillness that wolves achieve when they've chosen to wait for something. Outer Crave was a frontier pack, one she knew by name from her correspondence files. One of the edge territories that the Empire had classified as autonomous affiliates, which in practice meant too far to bother with except when they were needed as a buffer against the wilder territories beyond. She had written to their elder twice about disputed grazing lines. The elder had written back in a hand that suggested someone educated outside the formal system, careful and smart. "Why are you tracking me?" she said. Fenvaris looked at her with those gold eyes that were starting to stabilize as his shift settled back. Because our elders said that if you ever left that city on your own 2 feet with no guard and no banner, we were to find you before anyone else did. He paused. He's been waiting 4 years for tonight. The dark around her was full of wolves. Her blade was still loose in her hand, and somewhere behind her, she knew with the certainty that you develop when you have spent 3 years learning to read a palace and a man, that Kaelin Draven had not yet realized she was gone. The feast would still be running, the wine would still be moving, the court would be performing its joy for each other and for their new queen, and no one would have thought to check on the woman who had walked quietly out of the throne room, because that was the gift of her compliance. It had looked like acceptance, and acceptance meant she was filed, settled, dealt with. She had until dawn. By dawn, she needed to be somewhere that was not findable. She looked at Fen Varus and made the calculation in the space of a single breath. "Your elder," she said. "What does he want?" Fen Varus said, "He wants to show you what we've been building while the palace wasn't watching." The wolves in the trees were waiting. The road north stretched ahead of her into the dark, and behind her, Asheville glowed faint on the horizon, and in its throne room the man who had asked her to kneel was drinking to his new alliance. She sheathed the blade. "Take me to your elder," she said. 6 hours later, as Kaelin Draven descended from his throne with the first light of dawn turning the palace windows the color of cold iron, he sent a steward to the Luna's chambers with a formal acknowledgement document requiring her seal, a procedural necessity, the last piece of the alliance paperwork, the kind of thing that could wait until morning. The steward returned alone. "The chambers are empty, my king," he said. "Her seal is on the table. Her Luna crest is beside it. Her correspondence remains. But Kaelin held up one hand. The steward stopped. Outside, the palace wolves had begun to howl. All of them. Every wolf in the yard, in the stables, on the perimeter routes, all of them lifting their voices at once in the pale light of the first morning of the new alliance. And the sound of it moved through the stone corridors of Asheville like water finding the cracks in a wall, low and huge and directionless. The sound of an entire palace's worth of animals registering something their king had not yet understood. She was gone, and something the kingdom could not yet name had gone with her. The elder of Outer Crave was not what she expected. She had built a picture of him from the letters, careful diction, precise logic, the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself but reveals itself in what it chooses not to say. She had imagined someone older, weathered in the way of men who have led packs through hard decades, a certain grandfatherly gravitas. What she got was a man roughly 10 years older than herself, maybe 38, sitting at a rough-hewn table in a low-ceilinged hall with a cup of something hot between his hands and mud still drying on his boots. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. Not a clean blade scar, something messier, the kind left by an animal's claw or a poorly healed break. His eyes were dark and level, and he looked at her the way people look at things they've been waiting on for a long time without being sure they were right to wait. "Malus Thorn," he said. Not a question. "You already know what I look like," she said. "Your man identified me in the dark." "Fen's good at his work." He gestured at the chair across the table without ceremony. "Sit. You've been walking for 4 hours." She sat, because sitting was not capitulation. It was practical, and she had learned to distinguish between the two. Her feet were telling her things about the road that her pride didn't get a vote on. His name was Davin Crave, third-generation elder of Outer Crave, one of the 6-pack territories that occupied the highland fringe east of the Empire's last formal border post. He poured something into a second cup, broth, dark and hot, smelling of marrow and dried herbs, and pushed it across the table to her without asking if she wanted it. She drank. "You said you've been waiting 4 years," she said. "I've been watching for 4 years. There's a difference." He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "When you took over the Tereth's Edge provision situation, 3 months of palace resources redirected, no formal decree, no paper trail that any council member could challenge. Pack of 400 people ate through winter who wouldn't have otherwise." He paused. "That was the first thing." "That wasn't—" "I know what it wasn't," he said. "It wasn't official. That's the point." His eyes didn't move off her face. You did it because it needed doing and you had the access and the judgment to do it quietly. That's a specific kind of competence. Not everyone who has access has judgment. Not everyone who has judgment has access. You had both, and you used them for people who had nothing to trade for them. She looked at him steadily. You're framing it as if it was strategic. Wasn't it? It was necessary. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He set his cup down. Here's what I need you to understand about why you're in this room. The frontier pacts, not just Crave, all 6 of the Highland Fringe territories, have been in informal communication for 2 years. Not through the Empire's channels, through ours. We've been building something. He looked at her. It's not finished. It's maybe half built. But it's real, and it's working, and what it needs right now is something we don't have. She waited. Legitimacy, he said. Not from Ashvale. Ashvale's idea of legitimacy is a seal on a document and a sword to back it up. I mean the other kind. The kind where people look at what you're building and believe it's worth protecting because it actually protects them. He was quiet for a moment. We need someone who knows how to do what you did at Terath's Edge. On a larger scale, consistently, without a palace behind them. Melis set her cup down. I walked out of Ashvale 4 hours ago, she said. I have a pack of coins and a map, and no title. You understand that? Yes. And you want to offer me what exactly? I want to show you what we've been building, he said, and then I want you to decide whether it's worth your time. He said it plainly, with none of the flattery she would have expected from someone making a pitch. I'm not recruiting you. I'm not asking you to commit to anything. I'm asking you to look. He held her gaze. If you don't like what you see, you walk away. You've demonstrated tonight that walking away is something you're capable of. Something about the way he said it, not cruel, not sympathetic, just factual, moved through her in a way she didn't have an immediate name for. Why tonight? She said. You've been watching for 4 years. What made tonight the trigger? Devon picked up his cup. Because tonight you chose, he said. Before tonight, you were building something inside the palace's framework, which meant anything you built was subject to the palace's authority. The moment you walked out, anything you build belongs to itself. He drank. The question was always whether you'd ever leave. I didn't know. Frankly, I didn't think you would. Most people don't. She looked at the table. Most people, she said, don't get publicly asked to kneel in front of 300 witnesses. No, he agreed. They don't. The hall was quiet around them. Somewhere outside, she could hear the pack settling, wolves returning from their tracking, the low sounds of a community going about its late-night business, children being brought inside, fires being banked. It sounded nothing like the palace, and the difference was so sharp it almost had a physical quality. She looked up. Show me what you're building, she said. The settlement of Outer Crave spread across a high valley that the Empire's cartographers had marked as uninhabited highland terrain on their official maps, which was one of the more expensive errors those cartographers had ever made, and which Davon had chosen to leave uncorrected as a matter of policy. There were 400 people in Crave Valley, maybe more by recent count. Devon wasn't the type to hold still populations. A cluster of permanent buildings in the valley's center, well-constructed, stone-footed with timber above, the kind of architecture that said people intending to stay. Around them, a wider spread of more flexible structures, the kind that could be expanded or contracted as need required. But what Milas was looking at, in the gray pre-dawn light as Davon walked her through it, was not the buildings. It was the granary system. 3 connected stores shared across 4 families each, with a rotation system written on a board outside each door in a simple code she had to have explained to her and then understood immediately once she saw it. A distribution mechanism that prevented any single family from holding more than their seasonal share while also guaranteeing that no family went below a minimum threshold regardless of their harvest. It wasn't sophisticated economics. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, arrived at through obvious trial and error, with the evidence of the errors still visible in the small amendments and corrections written into the board in different inks. Who designed this? She said. Collectively, Devon said, over about 18 months. Started with a bad winter 2 years ago when 1 family had surplus and 7 had not enough. We tried 3 different systems before this one held. The other 5 packs. Do they have this? Different versions. We share what works. He paused. That's the thing we're building, not just the physical infrastructure, the practice of sharing what works. It sounds simple. It isn't, she said. No, it isn't. She turned from the granary and looked at the valley in the early gray light. The mountains to the north were losing their dark against the brightening sky, and the highland air was cold and smelled of pine and frost, and the particular mineral smell of high-altitude streams. It was beautiful in an austere way that had nothing to do with trying to be beautiful. What do you need that you don't have? She said. The other packs trust Crave because they know Crave, he said. We've built that over time, but there are 12 other settlements in the outer territories that aren't within our existing network. Some of them are suspicious of anything that looks like a larger organization because the only larger organization they've ever encountered is the Empire, and the Empire's relationship with frontier settlements is to ignore them until it needs their land or their sons. He paused. Someone needs to go to those 12 settlements and make the case that what we're building is different. That requires someone they'll listen to, someone with a track record of actually doing what they say they'll do. She looked at him. And you think that's me? I think you have 4 hours head start on a palace that doesn't know you're gone yet, he said, and that by the time they figure out you're gone, you could be beyond the Second Highland Ridge, which is outside the Empire's informal enforcement range. And I think in 3 years as Luna you made contact with settlement leadership across half the Empire's frontier territories, which means you have relationships that I don't have. He held her gaze. I think the question is what you want to do with the next chapter of your life, and I don't have any investment in what you decide. But I'd rather make you the offer than not. The light was growing. She had, by her estimate, 2 more hours before the palace discovered the empty chambers. Maybe 3 if the feast had run long enough and the morning routines were slow. Kaelin would not immediately assume she had left the city. He would check the palace first, the gardens, the wolf yard, the places where a woman nursing wounded pride might go to be alone. That check would take an hour. The city search would take another. By the time he authorized a road search, she would either be deep enough into the highlands to be irrelevant to his immediate capacity, or she wouldn't. She thought about Kaelin with the specific clarity that comes when you have stopped expecting anything from a person. It was a different kind of thinking than she had done about him for 3 years, cleaner, less weighted with the accumulated hope that a real bond generates. She thought about what he would do when he found the chambers empty, and she thought he would be angry. And then she thought about what kind of anger it would be, and she decided it would be the organizational kind, the anger of a man whose plan has encountered a variable he didn't account for, who now needs to recalculate. He would search for her. Not because he wanted her back, she did not allow herself the comfort of believing that. He would search because her disappearance was a variable, and variables were things Kaelin Draven brought under control. She was going to be a variable that didn't come under control. All right, she said to Davin, here's what I need. A fast horse, resupplied provisions for a week's ride, and one of your people who knows the Second Highland Pass well enough to get me through it before second light. She paused. And I need to know the names of your 12 outer settlements and who leads each one. Davin looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, Fen. Fen Varus materialized from somewhere behind her left shoulder with the disconcerting ease of a man who had been standing there for some time without announcing himself. He looked at Davin. Davin looked at him. Something passed between them that was probably an entire conversation in their shared pack shorthand. Get her a horse, Davin said. She crossed the Second Highland Pass as the sun came fully up, Fen Varus riding 6 lengths ahead and slightly left in the position of a scout rather than an escort, which she appreciated because it meant he was treating her as someone capable of defending herself rather than someone requiring protection. Her horse was a Highland breed, compact, short-legged, built for the altitude and the rocky terrain in a way that the palace horses never were. She had ridden the palace horses for 3 years, and they were magnificent animals, bred for appearance and speed on flat ground, and the particular visual effect of a mounted Luna processing through a crowd. This horse had no visual effect whatsoever. It simply worked. She had been riding for 3 hours when Fen pulled up without warning and held up a closed fist. She stopped. In the rocks above the pass, something moved. She put her hand on the short blade and waited. The wind was coming from the north, which was good. It meant whatever was in the rocks above hadn't had her scent until they were already committed to their position. Fen turned his horse and came back to her at a walk, unhurried. "Scout," he said quietly, "not ours." Ashvale marking on the saddlecloth. She felt the information land cleanly, without panic, the way information lands when you've already decided what you're doing and the news is simply a data point. They had found the road faster than she'd calculated, which meant one of two things. Either the palace had discovered her absence earlier than she estimated, or Kaelin had pre-positioned scouts on the Highland roads before last night's ceremony. She turned the second option over carefully. Pre-positioned scouts before his wife's public humiliation. That was either paranoid over-preparation or it was something else. Something that suggested he had known or suspected what she might do. That possibility settled in her chest like cold water. "How many?" she said. "One visible. Could be more in the high rocks." Fen's gold eyes were calm. "They haven't committed. They're observing." "Which means they're reporting back before engaging," she said. "They don't know if they're authorized to detain me." "Which means they don't know what you are right now," Fen said. "Former Luna or runaway. There's a difference in how you handle those." She understood his point immediately. The first was a personal matter, embarrassing but legally nebulous. The second was something that could be framed as defection, as theft of crown resources, as a half-dozen things that would justify forcible return. The scout above them was waiting for instruction, and the instruction would depend on how Kaelin chose to categorize what she had done. She needed to be past this ridge before that instruction came back. "Is there a secondary path?" she said. "There's a goat track," Fen said. 3 miles east. Adds 2 hours. "Take it." They went east along the high ridge, picking through terrain that was not a path so much as a suggestion, the horses placing their feet with the careful intelligence of animals who had done this before and knew the consequences of getting it wrong. Maelis rode close to the rock face, her hood up, her eyes on the terrain above and ahead. She was aware of every sound, wind, loose stone, the distant cry of something aerial moving high overhead. Her wolf was alert under her skin, its senses layered over hers in the way they worked when she allowed full integration, the smell of the world sharpening, the range of sound widening. She caught the second scout's position before Fen did. "Right," she said quietly. 100 yards. Behind the broken column of stone. Fen's eyes went there. Held. A fractional nod. They moved wide around it, and the scout didn't commit. They were still uncertain about their orders. That uncertainty was her window, and it was closing, and she used every foot of it. The first outer settlement she reached was called Heron's Fold, a name that didn't appear on any official Empire map, which told her everything she needed to know about its relationship with Ashvale. She came into it in the early afternoon, with Fen one step back and off to her right, and she came in walking rather than mounted because coming in on horseback when you weren't expected was an aggression, and she was not here to be aggressive. The woman who met her at the settlement's edge was maybe 60, with a rancher's build and the specific kind of watchfulness that people develop when they've spent decades living at the edge of other people's authority. She looked at Maelis the way you look at something that's off your usual map. Not hostile, not welcoming, assessing. "You're not from any pack I know," she said. "No," Maelis said. "I'm from Ashvale." The woman's eyes tightened fractionally. Not fear. Something older than fear, the residue of a long relationship with power that had rarely been reciprocal. "We paid our frontier levy," the woman said. "In full. In October." "I'm not here about the levy," Maelis said. "My name is Maelis Thorne. 6 months ago I redirected palace provisions to Terath's Edge through an unofficial channel. The elder there is a woman named Bryn Vassell. She has my correspondence." Something shifted in the woman's face. Not a lot. "Enough." "Bryn Vassell is my sister-in-law," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that asks a question without asking it. "What do you want?" the woman said. "To talk," Maelis said, "and to listen. In that order." She held the woman's eyes steadily. "I'm not connected to Asheville anymore. I left last night. Whatever I was there, I'm not that now." She paused. But I know how the empire works from the inside, and I know every pressure point where it fails the people at its edges. I think that knowledge might be worth something to you, if you're willing to hear it. The woman studied her for a long moment. Bryn said something about you, the woman said finally. In her last letter. She didn't elaborate immediately, letting the information sit there between them as a kind of test. What did she say? Melis asked. She said, if you ever meet the woman who made that winter survivable, listen to her, even if what she's saying makes you uncomfortable. The woman tilted her head slightly. Bryn doesn't say that about anyone. Bryn is a realist, Melis said. Yes, the woman said. So am I. A pause. Come in. I'll make tea. We'll talk. Her name was Jenna Fold. The settlement had taken its informal name from her family, 3 generations of Folds who had worked this high ground into something livable. She had 43 people in her settlement, a rotating arrangement with 2 neighboring communities for livestock management, and a specific problem with the empire's frontier taxation system that had been quietly draining her people's surplus for 4 years in ways that were technically legal and practically predatory. She explained it at the kitchen table with the matter-of-fact anger of someone who has been angry about something for a long time and has given up expecting anyone to fix it. Melis listened. She asked questions. She did not take notes because taking notes implied a kind of official function she didn't have, but she was building a picture, detailed and structural, the kind of picture she had spent 3 years building about the Empire's frontier territories from the inside. Only now she was building it from the outside, and the view was radically different. From inside Asheville, the frontier taxation discrepancy was a line item in a budget report that came through the Council of Trade twice a year. A small notation about regional adjustment mechanisms that she had flagged twice and been told twice was under review. From Jenna Fold's kitchen table, it was the difference between a community that was slowly being hollowed out and a community that could build itself a future. There are 12 settlements in the Outer Territories dealing with variations of this same issue, Melis said. Different specifics, same structural cause. The frontier levy was set by a council that has never visited a frontier settlement. It was set based on projected productivity estimates from surveyors who came through for 3 days each. It does not account for highland winters, for the 2-year soil recovery cycle in high-altitude growing, for the cost differential of operating at altitude versus the lowland territories the levy was originally designed for. Jenna was looking at her. You know all this, Jenna said, from the inside. Yes. And you didn't fix it. The words weren't cruel. They were direct in the way a rancher is direct, with the expectation of a direct answer. No, Melis said. I flagged it twice. I was told it was under review. I didn't have the formal authority to override a Council of Trade determination, and the people I could have pressured to do so were not interested in the political capital it would cost them to reform a system that was producing revenue. She held Jenna's gaze. I failed you. I want to be clear about that. I had information and access, and I did not convert them into action fast enough. Jenna was quiet. And now you're here, she said. Now I'm here, Melis said. Without access to the palace, but with everything I know about where the system is broken and how it's broken and what would actually fix it. She paused. Davin Crave is building something in the Highlands, a network, a different kind of governance structure, one where the settlements at the edges have a voice in the decisions that affect them instead of receiving those decisions from people who've never seen their land. She looked at Jenna steadily. I think it can work. I think it needs help. And I think you know things that Davin doesn't know yet, because you're 30 miles further out than he is, and you've been managing a specific version of the frontier problem for longer than his settlement has existed. Jenna looked at the table. What are you asking? She said. I'm asking you to talk to him, Melis said. Not commit to anything, not sign anything, just talk to him. And let me take your account of the taxation mechanism back to the other settlements I'm visiting, so we can build a complete picture of how widespread the problem is. She paused. Information is the beginning of everything. Without an accurate picture, you're solving problems in the dark. With it, you can start building something real. The afternoon was halfway gone when she left Heron's Fold. Jenna gave her resupplied provisions from the settlement store. She offered to pay. Jenna waved it off with the specific impatience of someone who finds monetary transactions between neighbors a kind of insult, and watched her mount from the settlement's edge with an expression that had moved from assessment to something more like consideration. "You said you were from Ashevale," Jenna said. "Past tense." "Past tense," Melis confirmed. "What are you now?" She thought about it for the span of a single breath. "I don't have a name for it yet," she said. Jenna nodded slowly. "Let me know when you do," she said. "Names matter out here. Things without names don't get defended." Melis rode out of Heron's Fold onto the Highland track north, and the wind came down off the mountains and pushed at her back as if it had somewhere it wanted her to go. Nut. She was 2 days into the Outer Territory circuit, 4 settlements visited, 3 productive conversations, and 1 elder who had told her flatly to take her Ashevale connections and deposit them somewhere anatomically complex, which she had accepted without argument as both a legitimate grievance and a data point about the depth of suspicion she was working against. When Fenn pulled up his horse at the top of a ridge and said, "We have a problem," she came up beside him and looked at what he was looking at. On the road below, 3 miles back and moving at pace, was a party of riders. 8 of them. She couldn't read the standard at this distance, but she didn't need to. The formation was a tracking formation, not a patrol, not a diplomatic escort. Someone had sent 8 trained riders into the Highland in formation, and the only person who had 8 trained riders to send was the man she had left standing in his throne room 2 mornings ago. Kaelin had sent for her. Not messengers, trackers. She sat on her Highland horse at the top of the ridge and looked at the party below, and something moved through her that wasn't fear and wasn't quite anger. It was recognition, the specific recognition of a moment that has been coming and has now arrived. He had decided she was a variable to be managed, which meant she had to decide what kind of variable she was going to be. "How far to the Crave Network's outer safe point?" she said. 6 miles north, Fenn said. "But the track forks in 3 miles. They've got a good tracker, they'll read the fork. And if we don't go to the safe point, East Track takes you into Ferris territory, Pack land. The Empire's trackers don't go into Pack territory without formal authorization. How long does formal authorization take?" "From Ashevale?" Fenn looked at her. "Assuming Kaelin requests it through the proper channels? 4 days minimum. The Pack elders don't process emergency requests as a matter of policy. They made that rule specifically because the Empire kept manufacturing emergencies." She looked at the riders below. They were covering ground fast. She had, at most, 40 minutes before they reached this ridge. "What's in Ferris territory?" she said. "The Ferris Pack," Fenn said. 800 people. Old bloodlines. They've been fully autonomous for 60 years. They don't deal with Ashevale. He paused. They've been watching Devan's network from a distance. Interested, but uncommitted. We've been trying to open a channel with them for a year. She looked at him. "They'll deal with you?" she said. "I don't know," he said, "but I know they'll deal with the woman who walked out of Ashevale with nothing and is currently being tracked through their border territory by a palace hunting party." He held her gaze. "That story, that's something the Ferris elders will want to hear from the source." Below them, the riders were closer. She thought about Kaelin, who was sitting in Ashevale right now, managing the calculus of her absence, what it meant politically, how it looked to the court, what the narrative of a vanished Luna did to the new alliance's optics. She thought about Celine Varick, who had waited 20 seconds to give her leave to rise from her knees, who had chosen the delay with the precision of someone who understood that the performance of power is as important as the possession of it. She thought about Jenna Fold, who had said names matter out here. Things without names don't get defended. She was still deciding what name to give herself. But she knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who has made a decision and can feel it locking into place in her bones, she knew that the name would not be returned Luna. It would not be property recovered. It would not be a variable brought back under someone else's control. She looked at the riders below one more time. Then she turned her horse east, toward Ferris territory, toward the 800 people who had held their autonomy for 60 years and who were watching a woman ride toward them with a palace hunting party at her back, and nothing to her name but knowledge, a map, and the particular kind of freedom that only exists on the other side of having nothing left to lose. "Fen," she said. "Yeah. Ride." They went east at speed, and the highland wind came hard off the mountain face, and below them the tracking party crested the ridge and saw the fork in the road, and for one suspended moment, 8 riders at a standstill, staring at 2 sets of hoofprints splitting in different directions. The Empire's reach and her new life hung in the balance of a single decision by a single man at the head of a hunting party who had to choose which track to follow. And whichever track he chose, everything that happened next would be different. There was no road back from this ridge. Not for her. Not for them. The moment the hoofprints forked, the story forked with them. And some part of her, running at full speed toward a border she had never crossed, understood that this was the true point of no return. Not the wolf yard. Not the city gate, not even the dawn road north. This ridge, this fork, this choice. The land ahead of her was unmapped, unauthorized, and entirely her own. She rode into it without looking back. The Ferris border was marked by nothing visible. No wall, no post, no carved stone announcing that here the empire ended and something else began. Just a change in the quality of the air. Or maybe that was her imagination, the mind constructing sensation to match what it knew, and then a rider coming down from the tree line at a canter, positioned squarely in the track ahead, sitting his horse with the ease of someone who has held this position 100 times and found it comfortable every time. He was young, maybe 22, Ferris pack coloring, the dark copper skin and near black hair common to the mountain bloodlines, with the build of someone who had been doing physical work since he was old enough to be useful. He carried no weapon she could see, which was its own kind of statement. The lack of visible weapon in a border situation was not naivety. It was confidence, and confidence had to be earned from somewhere, and what it was earned from here was 800 people in the trees at his back. He looked at her, then at Fen, then at the direction she'd come from. "Asheville tracking party," he said. 6 riders. They stopped at the border marker. A pause. "They're waiting." "How long have you been watching us?" Melis said. "Since you hit the Eastern Fork." He said it without apology. "You ride like someone who knows where she's going even when she doesn't know the territory. That's unusual enough to watch." His eyes were dark and settled. "The Outer Crave man I know. You I don't." "Melis Thorne," she said. Nothing shifted in his face immediately. Then, after a beat, something did. Not recognition exactly, more like the arrival of a name he'd heard in a different context and was now placing in this one. "Former Luna of Asheville," he said. "Former," she confirmed. He looked at her for another moment, then turned his horse without further ceremony. "Come with me," he said. "Elder Sarah will want to speak with you herself." Elder Sarah of the Ferris Pack was 70 years old and looked like the mountain itself had decided to take human form as an experiment and found the result acceptable. She was short, dense, with the particular solidity of very old wolves whose bodies had stopped bothering with anything non-essential, and she had white hair that she wore loose to her shoulders in defiance of every formal convention Melis had ever encountered. She received them in an open-sided hall built into the hillside, with the valley spread below and the afternoon light coming in flat and cold from the west, and she looked at Melis with the eyes of someone who had been watching the Empire from a safe distance for 6 decades and had developed very precise opinions about what she saw. "Sit," she said. Melis sat. Ben was gestured to a bench along the far wall with the wordless efficiency of someone used to managing visitors and their companions. He went without comment. Sarah looked at Melis's hands, a habit of old pack elders. The hands told more than the face, and then at her face, and then she said, "How many outer settlements have you visited?" 4, Melis said. "I was 2 days into the circuit when the tracking party picked up our trail." "And in those 4 settlements, what did you find?" "The same structural problem in 4 different configurations," Melis said. "The frontier levee mechanism is functionally extractive at the highland altitude. Not by design necessarily. I think the original design was simply ignorant of the conditions. but the effect is the same as if it had been designed to drain. 4 settlements, averaging 40% surplus extraction above what they can sustainably lose over a period of years. She paused. 2 of those settlements are within one bad winter of real crisis. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You know this because you were inside. Yes. And now you're outside. Yes. By choice. Melis looked at her steadily. I walked out after a public ceremony in which the Alpha King asked me to kneel before his new queen in front of 300 people. I walked out that same night, and I have not been back, and I will not be going back. She said it flatly, without self-pity and without performance. That's the full account. Sarah was quiet for several seconds in the way of someone who is not deciding what to think. She had already decided, but is deciding how much of what she thinks to share. Davon Crave has been sending us letters for 2 years, Sarah said finally. Careful letters, respectful. He's not a stupid man. No, Melis agreed. We haven't responded to them. Sarah tilted her head slightly. Do you know why? Because Crave is at the edge of the Empire's territorial range, not beyond it, Melis said, which means anything Crave builds is potentially subject to Empire authority if Ashvale decides to extend its enforcement reach. Joining a network with Crave as its center means joining something that could be absorbed. She paused. You've held autonomy for 60 years by maintaining clean separation. Joining Davin's network risks contaminating that separation with Empire adjacency. Sarah looked at her. You have a clear head for someone who just had their life upended, she said. I've had 2 days of writing to think, Melis said, and I've been doing this kind of analysis for 3 years. The methodology doesn't change because I changed sides. Something moved in Sarah's face, the fractional adjustment of an elder reassessing a variable upward. What would you tell me about the risk, she said, if you were advising me? I'd tell you the risk is real, Melis said. Davin's network is half built, and the Empire hasn't noticed it yet because it's operating below the threshold of what Ashvale considers worth managing. That changes if the network grows. The Empire doesn't act against things it ignores. It acts against things it notices. She held Sarah's gaze. The question is whether a larger, more capable network is actually easier to protect than a smaller one, or whether it's just a larger target. And what's your answer? My answer is that it depends entirely on whether the network can establish enough autonomous legitimacy before the Empire notices it to make the cost of acting against it politically prohibitive. She paused. Which is a race. And right now we're losing it because we're building in isolation instead of building in coordination. Sarah was quiet. Then she said, Stay tonight. We'll continue this in the morning. She was given a room in the hillside hall, small, stone-walled, with a narrow window that looked out over the valley. She sat on the bed's edge in the dark after the settlement's fires banked, and she thought about the tracking party sitting at the border marker 6 miles south, and she thought about what it meant that Kaelin had sent them so quickly. And she thought, in the careful, methodical way she was learning to think about things now, about what he actually wanted. He hadn't sent a messenger with a letter. He hadn't sent a diplomatic envoy. He'd sent trackers, which was a choice about method, and the method chose itself based on what the sender wanted to achieve. You sent trackers when you wanted to find something. You sent them in formation, 8 riders, when you wanted to find something and have the capacity to manage it when you did. He wasn't asking her to come home. He was retrieving her. She lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the stone ceiling and felt the specific texture of that understanding. Not the pain of it, she was getting beyond the pain of it, but the shape of it, which was cleaner and more useful than pain. He had made his decision in the throne room, and the decision was complete, and her disappearance was a complication of that decision, not a reconsideration of it. He wasn't sending 8 trained riders because he missed her. He was sending them because she was an uncontrolled variable, and he was an Alpha King, and uncontrolled variables were threats regardless of their emotional relationship to the throne. She breathed in the cold highland air and thought, then I need to stop being retrievable before he finds a way to retrieve me. The Ferris pack was the key. 800 people, 60 years of autonomous history, and an elder who had just spent an hour asking her questions that suggested she was very close to a yes she hadn't yet said aloud. If Ferris joined Davin's network, the network doubled in size and gained a center of gravity that was genuinely outside the Empire's enforcement range. If Ferris joined, the other outer settlements that had been watching from a distance, 3 of them, by Davin's account, would have a reason to believe the network was real rather than aspirational. She needed Sarah's yes. She was still working out how to earn it when she fell asleep. She woke to Fenn's hand on her shoulder and his voice very quiet and very controlled saying her name. She was fully alert in the time it takes to pull a single breath. Pack-raised reflex. What? Ryder came in an hour ago, he said. From Crave. Davin sent him fast, yo. Horse is blown. His jaw was tight. There's news from Ashvale. She sat up. What Davan's Ryder had brought was a letter, written in Davan's careful hand, and the letter was 3 paragraphs, and the first paragraph was the situation, and the second paragraph was what he had been able to verify, and the third paragraph was what he thought she should know about what it meant. She read it once. Then she read it again, slowly, because the first reading produced a sensation she needed to be sure she was interpreting correctly. The situation. Ashvale had issued a formal proclamation, distributed to all frontier territories and pack authorities within imperial range, declaring Maelys Thorne absent without authorization from her duties and requesting any information about her whereabouts. That was not surprising. She had expected something like it. What she had not expected was the second paragraph. The proclamation cited as the legal basis for her status as an unauthorized absence an instrument she had never heard of. The Luna Accountability Compact, a document purportedly signed at the time of her bond ceremony 3 years ago, which stipulated that in cases of voluntary abandonment of the Luna role, the departing Luna could be held liable for any harm to the kingdom resulting from the disruption of her duties. Davan's Ryder had obtained a copy of the proclamation text. She read the citation language 3 times. Then she set the letter down on the bed and sat very still and thought carefully about what she was reading, because what she was reading required care. She had signed documents at her bond ceremony. Many of them, the bond ceremony for a ruling pair, generated a stack of formal instruments, most of them procedural, and the ceremony itself moved quickly, and she had been 24 years old and newly bonded and not yet versed in the specific way that legal documents embedded in ceremonies could function as traps you didn't recognize until they were sprung. She had signed what she was presented and asked about the ones she didn't understand and been told what they meant by the council liaison who managed the ceremony, a man named Proctor Aldous, who she now realized had been appointed to that role by someone and that the someone was worth knowing. The Luna Accountability Compact. She had signed something with that name. She remembered the name now, surfacing from the stack of ceremony documents, and she remembered Proctor Aldous telling her it was a standard framework document, a mutual accountability measure between the Luna and the Crown's obligations, standard language. Every Luna in Draven history had signed one. She did not remember reading what it actually said. She was reading now, in Davan's precise transcription of the proclamation's citation language, what it actually said. And what it said was that if a Luna departed her role voluntarily without a formal dissolution process, which required the Alpha King's written consent, she could be held accountable for any damage to the Empire's interests that could be attributed to the vacancy. The Empire's borders had been destabilizing for 8 months. The Northern Alliance had been shaky. The frontier levy problem had been creating settlement unrest for 4 years. None of those things were her fault. She knew that, and the law of cause and effect knew that, and anyone who examined the timeline with clear eyes would know it too. But the law of cause and effect and the law of political documents were not the same law. The third paragraph was what Davan thought she should know about what it meant. He thought it meant Selene. He thought the proclamation's timing, 3 days after Miles's departure, with a document that nobody in the frontier territories had ever heard of before this morning, suggested that the instrument had been prepared in advance, that someone had reviewed the bond ceremony documents looking for leverage, had found the compact, had drafted the proclamation language, and had it ready to issue the moment it was needed, the moment she left. She sat on the narrow bed in the gray pre-dawn of the Ferris settlement and held the letter and felt something shift in her understanding that was not like the way things shift when you learn something new. It was the shift of things you already knew falling into a configuration that suddenly made perfect sense. Celine had not been an opportunist. She had not materialized at the right moment, been in the right place, caught Kaylin's eye at the right time. The public humiliation had not been Kaylin's idea executed with Celine's complicity. She turned it over, examined every surface, checked it against every data point she had. Celine had engineered it. Not the bond. You couldn't engineer a wolf's recognition of its mate. That was biology. That was the most fundamental involuntary thing in their world. But everything else, the 8 months of presence at military councils, the strategic positioning, the timing of the alliance proposal, which had arrived at the specific moment when Kaylin's relationship with Melis had been strained enough by distance and unspoken things that he was vulnerable to a different kind of influence. The document prepared in advance, the proclamation ready to issue. Celine had come for Ashevale, not for Kaylin, or not only for Kaylin, for the crown. The alliance was real, the military benefit was real, and Celine had made herself indispensable to it, had made herself the only conceivable vehicle for it, had shaped the terms so that the only way Kaylin could secure the eastern border was through her. And then she had made sure that the woman who might notice what she was doing was neutralized before she could become a problem. The public kneeling, the 20-second delay. The proclamation prepared and waiting, every piece of it designed by someone who had assessed Melis Thorne very carefully and concluded that her specific weakness, the thing that could be used to drive her out, was not fear, was not vanity, was not ambition. It was dignity, the one thing she could not survive being publicly stripped of. Celine had stripped it in front of 300 witnesses, and she had been right, and Melis had walked exactly where she was supposed to walk. She stood up. The letter was still in her hand. The anger was there. She could feel it now, fully formed, not the loose ambient anger of the past 3 days, but something with specific shape and temperature, the kind of anger that arrives when understanding replaces uncertainty and gives the feeling somewhere precise to land. She breathed through it carefully, the way you breathe through a wound you're examining, because anger was useful and she intended to use it, but first it had to be controlled, had to be placed correctly, had to be aimed rather than simply released. She took the letter to Fenn. He read it. She watched his face while he read. The jaw tightening, the slight flare of the nostrils, the eyes going still in the way that wolves' eyes go still when something triggers the hunting response. "The compact," he said. "Have you heard of it?" "No." He set the letter down. "But if it's real, she said. "I signed it. I just didn't know what it said." She paused. "That's on me." "You were 24. "Yes," she said. "And I should have read everything I signed, regardless of what I was told it meant. That's not self-pity, that's accounting." She looked at him. "What matters now is what it does." What it did was give the Empire legal standing to pursue her, not as a personal matter between Kaylin and a former Luna, which would have been awkward, politically costly, something a king might let slide for appearances, but as a formal instrument, a document with her signature, a liability that could be quantified and enforced. "She's mobilized the Empire's legal apparatus against me," Melis said, "which means it's not Kaylin's call anymore whether to pursue me or let me go. It's the Council's call, and the Council will pursue it because pursuing it is cheap, and not pursuing it sets a precedent they don't want to set." She paused. "She's made me a political problem instead of a personal one. That's very good work." Ben looked at her with the specific expression of someone absorbing that she had just called the thing that was trying to destroy her an example of good work. "She planned this before you left," he said. "She planned this before I left," Melis confirmed. "Which means she assessed me, identified the point of leverage, prepared the exit route and the legal follow-up, and executed it in sequence over probably months." She breathed out slowly. "I'm going to need to show this to Sarah." "Why Sarah?" "Because it changes the calculation for Ferris joining the network," she said. "Sarah needs to know that joining isn't just a question of autonomous territory boundaries anymore. It's a question of whether the Empire will eventually decide that an autonomous network large enough to matter constitutes a threat to its stability and act accordingly, and whether they'll use instruments like this one to justify it. She looked at Fenn directly. It also changes what the network needs to be. It can't be half-built anymore. It needs to be real, fast, and it needs to be real enough that acting against it costs more than leaving it alone. Fenn held her gaze. "You're not running anymore," he said. She looked at the letter in her hand. She thought about Celine Varick, who had sat on the dais step with her hands folded and her expression perfectly calibrated and had let the silence stretch to 20 seconds, who had prepared a legal document and kept it in reserve like a blade she had sharpened over months, who had engineered a queen's path through the body of another woman's dignity and done it so cleanly that the woman hadn't understood what had happened until she was already 3 days deep into the Highlands. She thought about that, and she thought about Kaelin, who had said yes in the flat. Certain voice of a man who had closed a door, and who was now allowing a legal apparatus to be used against a woman he had bonded with for 3 years, either because he had chosen to allow it, or because he didn't yet understand that he was allowing it. She thought about 24-year-old Malis Thorne signing a stack of documents at a bond ceremony and trusting that the man across the table from her would not one day need to use them as weapons. "No," she said. "I'm not running." Sarah read the letter at the long table in the open hall, with the morning light coming in from the east and her face giving nothing away while she read. When she finished, she set it down with the deliberateness of someone placing an object exactly where they want it. "This is Celine Varick's work," Sarah said. "Yes," Malis said. "You're certain." "I'm certain enough to act on it," Malis said, "which in this situation is the same as certain." Sarah looked out at the valley below the hall, where the settlement was beginning its morning. Fires started, animals fed, the ordinary machinery of a community that had survived 6 decades on its own terms, running through its daily routines. "If I join Davin's network," Sarah said slowly, "I bring Ferris Pack into a structure that now has an Empire legal instrument aimed at its founding member." She paused. "Celine Varick is smart enough to extend that instrument's reach if the network grows large enough to bother her." "Yes," Malis said. "She is." "So you're asking me to join a network that is currently being actively targeted by the most sophisticated political operator in Ashvale." "I'm not asking you to join," Malis said. "You were right last night. I'm not here to recruit. I'm here to make sure you have accurate information." She held Sarah's eyes. "What I'm telling you is that the threat to autonomous pact territories from Ashvale is not static. It has a driver now. Someone who is actively working to consolidate power in the Crown, who views anything outside the Crown's control as a liability, and who has demonstrated that she is willing and able to prepare and execute long-term strategies against specific targets." She paused. "Ferris has been autonomous for 60 years because the Empire never had a sufficient reason to act against you. What Celine Varick is building is a regime that will generate those reasons systematically for every territory that sits outside its control. Whether you join the network or not, you are not going to be left alone indefinitely." Sarah was quiet for a long time. The settlement below went about its morning. "What do you need?" Sarah said finally. "Access to your network of outer territory contacts," Malis said. "The ones you've spent 60 years building that I don't have, and Davon doesn't have. And I need your public endorsement of the network. Not a formal joining if you're not ready, but an endorsement that the other autonomous pacts can see. That changes the legitimacy calculation for every settlement that's been watching from a distance. And in exchange, everything I know about how the Empire makes decisions, where its legal instruments have weaknesses, and how Celine Varick thinks." She met Sarah's gaze without flinching. "I was inside. I watched how it works. I know where the seams are." Sarah looked at her for a long measuring moment. Then she said, "There's a council of the Outer Territory Elders. It meets 3 times a year. The next meeting is in 12 days, at the high ground settlement called Cragen's Flat. It's 3 days' ride north of here, well outside any imperial boundary." She paused. "I have not previously chosen to share the location of these meetings with anyone connected to Ashvale." "I understand," Malis said. "I am now choosing to share it with you," Sarah said. "Not because I trust you fully. I don't yet, and you should know that plainly. But because you came to me with information that cost you something to share, and in my experience, that's the only reliable measure of intent." She picked up the letter and held it for a moment. "This is going to cause you serious trouble." "Yes," Melis said. "Are you prepared for what it means to fight someone who planned 3 moves ahead before you knew the game had started?" The question was not rhetorical. Sarah was genuinely asking, with the directness of an elder who had seen people overestimate themselves at the edge of difficult things and had learned to ask plainly rather than watch the outcome. Milas thought about the answer with the same care she had given everything in the past 3 days. She thought about the woman she had been in the throne room, the one who had decided the safest thing was to be the floor, to let the moment move over her, to survive with her dignity intact and figure out the rest later. That calculus had made sense then. The dignity had not survived intact regardless, and the later had arrived faster and harder than she had expected. She thought about what Davon had said at the kitchen table, that the question was always whether she would leave, and that most people didn't. She had left. And Celine had been ready for her to leave, had been counting on it, had prepared a legal trap for exactly this outcome, which meant Celine had assessed her as someone who would run. She was going to need Celine to keep believing that, and she was going to need to do something that a person who was running would never do. "No," she said to Sarah, "I am not prepared for it. I don't have the resources, the formal authority, or the network established enough to fight someone who has had months to prepare." She held the elder's gaze. "But I have 12 days before the Outer Council meeting, and I have the territory contacts from 4 settlements and whatever you're willing to share, and I have a very clear picture of exactly how Celine Varick thinks." She breathed in steadily. "And I have something she doesn't." Sarah waited. "She planned for me to disappear," Melis said. "She planned for me to run, to hide, to spend my energy surviving instead of building. She built the compact to keep me reactive." She paused. "She did not plan for me to turn around." The hall was quiet around them. Below, the settlement moved through its mourning, unhurried and self-possessed, the ordinary work of people who had spent 60 years proving that another way was possible. Sarah set the letter down. "Cragen's flat," she said. 12 days. But it was what arrived 4 hours later that shattered the shape of everything Melis had constructed. Devon's second rider came in hard, the horse lathered and the man barely keeping his seat, and before he had fully dismounted, he was saying her name with a quality of urgency that made the settlement around him go quiet. He had a second letter, shorter than the first, less careful. The border alliance at the northern frontier, the one Kaylin had been struggling to maintain for months, the one she had been quietly supporting through correspondence with the pact territories that held the key passes, had collapsed overnight. Not through neglect, not through the slow erosion she had been watching. It had collapsed because someone had submitted forged correspondence to the Northern Pack elders. Letters in her hand, or something close enough to her hand that the elders had accepted them, advising those packs to dissolve their treaty arrangements with Ashvale and operate independently, citing the Crown's demonstrated bad faith. Letters she had never written. She read the description of them twice. The handwriting was described as consistent with her known correspondence style. The seal was described as a reasonable approximation of her Luna seal. The content was described as specific enough to the border situation that it could only have been written by someone with intimate knowledge of those negotiations. Someone had counterfeited her correspondence, had used it to destroy the Northern Alliance, and had timed it, she checked the date on the writer's account, to coincide with the proclamation so that both things landed in the same window. The legal liability document and the evidence of wrongdoing. The trap and the proof of the crime the trap was designed to manufacture. Celine had not just planned for Melis to run. Celine had needed Melis to run, because Melis running was what made the forged correspondence plausible. A former Luna, publicly humiliated, suddenly vanished, now apparently sending letters destabilizing the Empire's borders. The story assembled itself from the outside with a logic that didn't require anyone to have actually thought it through, because the elements all pointed the same direction. She was being framed for the destruction of the very alliances she had spent 3 years building. She stood in the yard of the Ferris settlement holding 2 letters, one in each hand, and she felt the full weight of it land on her. Not with the clean anger of understanding, not with the clarity she had found in the pre-dawn room. This was different. This was the specific vertigo of discovering that you were not simply in a difficult situation, but inside a constructed situation, a story someone else had written for you, with an ending someone else had chosen. Fen was beside her. He read the second letter over her shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to move on the Empire while Kaelin is managing this." She looked at him. "The border collapses," he said, his voice flat and thinking. "Kaelin has to respond. He has to address the northern territories, reassure the Pack elders, manage the diplomatic fallout. That takes him out of the capital, out of the daily administration. It creates a window for Selene to consolidate her position in Ashvale while his attention is external." He looked at Malus. "She's not just coming for you, she's moving on the whole throne." The yard was very quiet around them, and Malus Thorne stood in the high cold air of the Ferris settlement, with forged letters being used in her name to break apart the alliances she had built, with a legal instrument hunting her across the highlands, with a woman she had underestimated dismantling an empire from the inside. And she understood with the absolute irreversible clarity of someone who has reached the edge of one version of themselves and has nowhere left to go but through, that she could not fight this as the person she had been. The woman who had walked across 40 feet of marble with her chin level and her hands still and her wolf quiet, who had chosen the floor over the fight, who had trusted that dignity was its own protection, that woman's tools were not equal to this situation. They had never been equal to this situation. Selene had assessed her correctly. She had run. She had run beautifully, competently, with exactly the kind of quiet, controlled capability that was her nature, and it had walked her straight into the center of a trap that had been waiting for her. She had to stop being the person Selene had planned for. The person Selene had planned for ran and hid and survived and waited. She was going to have to become someone who did not wait. She looked at Fen, who was looking at her with those steady gold eyes. "Get me a fire and paper," she said. "I have 8 letters to write before nightfall, and then I need you to find me the fastest riders in the Ferris pack." "What are the letters?" "I'm going to every outer settlement elder on Davon's list and Sarah's list both," she said. "I'm calling the council meeting forward, not 12 days, 4. She folded both letters and put them in her cloak. "And I need Davon to get word to the Northern Pack elders directly, before Asheville's version of events gets there first." She looked at Fen. "Selene needs me reactive. She needs me managing my own survival. The moment I stop doing that and start moving toward her instead of away, she has a problem she didn't build a solution for." Fen studied her. "You're going to give her a target that doesn't behave like the target she planned for," he said. "Yes," Malus said. "That's more dangerous," he said, for you." "Yes," she said again. "It is." She walked toward the hall, and the cold highland wind came down off the mountain in a long, steady push that moved through the settlement with the indifference of weather, touching everything equally, favoring nothing. And behind her, somewhere south beyond 2 ridges and a border marker, 6 of Kaelin Draven's best riders sat their horses and waited for instruction that was increasingly coming not from the Alpha King at all, but from the woman who slept in his throne room and had been planning for 3 years what she intended to do with it. The council met in 8 days, not 4. 4 had been the goal, and 8 was the reality, and the difference came down to 2 elders whose territory runners got lost in the early snow that hit the high passes 6 days after Malus sent her letters, and 1 elder who refused to move until she received a face-to-face account from Fen Varus, specifically because she had dealt with Crave before and trusted its people and trusted nobody else. Malus accepted all of this without argument because the alternative was accepting no counsel at all, and 8 days was still faster than anyone had assembled the outer territories in living memory. Cregan's Flat was a high-altitude clearing ringed by pine and black rock, sheltered on 3 sides by the mountain's shoulder, and open to the south with a view that on clear days showed you the distant lowland haze where Ashvale sat in its valley. The day the council assembled, it was not clear. Low clouds sat on the peaks and the temperature had dropped enough that breath came out visible, and the 11 elders who arrived from across the outer territories came in with frost on their cloaks, and the specific alertness of people who have traveled difficult ground to be somewhere they've decided matters. Mayelis had been there since the previous afternoon. She had used the extra time to think, rather than to prepare a speech, because speeches were what you gave when you needed to perform conviction. She was not performing anything. What she had to say was simply what was true, and the truth was either sufficient or it wasn't, and there was nothing she could add to it by rehearsing. Sarah sat at the far end of the council circle. She had said nothing to Milas since the morning she gave her Cregan's flat's location, and her silence had not been cold. It had been the silence of someone watching, continuing to assess, reserving the weight of her position for the moment it mattered most. Devon was not there. Devon was 3 days' ride south, managing the fallout of the forged correspondence from a position where he could actually intercept the narrative before it reached the Northern elders through official channels. They had agreed on this division before Malis left Crave territory quickly, in the 10-minute conversation that their situation allowed. "I'll take the council," she had said. "You're not part of the network officially," he had said. Not an objection, a practicality. "Then make me part of it officially," she had said. "Now, whatever the designation is." He had looked at her with the same dark-level eyes from that first kitchen table meeting. "Coalition advocate," he had said. "It's not a title we've used before because we haven't had anyone doing the work you're doing." "It'll do," she had said. So she stood in the council circle at Cregan's flat as coalition advocate, a designation that meant exactly what the work made it mean, nothing more and nothing less. And she laid out what she knew in the order that made the most structural sense, which was not chronological, but causal. Not what happened when, but what caused what, and what that meant for the people sitting in this circle. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. She told them about the levy mechanism and the 4 settlements she had visited and what she had found there. She told them about the compact and what it meant legally, and what it said about how the current crown thought about frontier territories. She told them about the forged correspondence and what its existence implied about the sophistication and long-term planning of whoever had executed it. She told them about the Northern Border Alliance's collapse and why it mattered to people who lived well beyond that border. She told them what she believed Celine Varick was building in Ashvale, not as speculation, but as inference from a pattern of actions she had watched accumulate over 8 months from inside the palace. She did not tell them what to do. She told them what was true and let the logic speak for itself, because that was the only kind of argument that held in a circle of 11 people who had survived long enough in autonomous territory to know the difference between being convinced and being manipulated. When she finished, the clearing was quiet except for the wind in the pines. Then the elder from Heron's Fold, Jenna, who had given her provisions and told her names matter, said, "You walked away from a crown to come tell us we're in danger." "Yes," Malis said. "Why?" She had expected the question in some form. She had not prepared an answer because the answer was simply what it was. "Because I spent 3 years trying to do this work from inside a structure that was never going to allow it fully. I did what I could inside the structure, and it wasn't enough. Outside the structure, with the right network and the right information moving between the right people, the work is actually possible." She paused. "And because someone with a great deal of patience and a very long view is systematically working to ensure that anything outside the Crown's control becomes the Crown's property. If that succeeds, the work I'm describing becomes impossible. Permanently." Jenna nodded slowly. "What does the network need from us?" said the elder from a settlement called High Craig, a compact man with the northern coloring and the kind of weathered patience that suggested he had been running his territory for a very long time. "Formal affiliation," Malis said. "An agreement to share information through the network's channels. Participation in the distribution framework that Crave and its partner territories have been developing." She met his eyes. "And a willingness to make that affiliation public. Not loudly. I'm not asking for declarations, but visibly enough that the pattern is readable by anyone who looks for it." "You want the Empire to see us," he said. "I want the Empire to see that if they act against one of us, they act against all of us," she said. "The strength of the lever is proportional to the size of what it lifts." The council went back and forth for another 2 hours. She answered questions, corrected misunderstandings, twice acknowledged things she did not know rather than guess, which she had found in 3 years of political work was the single most reliable way to build credibility with people who could smell the difference between honest uncertainty and strategic evasion. At the end of 2 hours, 9 of the 11 elders voted affiliation. The remaining 2 declined not out of hostility, but out of the specific caution of communities whose survival had depended on never being on any list anywhere. And she accepted their decision with the same equanimity she tried to bring to everything, because 9 was real, and 9 with Sarah's endorsement and Ferris Pack's 60 years of autonomous legitimacy behind it, was something that had not existed in this territory 48 hours ago. Sarah walked with her to the edge of the clearing afterward, while the other elders were making their departures. 9, Sarah said. 9, Melis agreed. The 2 who declined will reconsider when they see the 9 holding. Probably, Melis said. I'm not counting on it. Sarah looked at her. What do you do now? Melis looked south, toward the distant lowland haze. Davon needs what happened here today on paper and in the hands of the Northern Pack elders before Asheville's version gets there. I need to get back to him. She paused. And then I need to find a way to get the truth about the forged correspondence into enough hands that the story it was trying to tell loses its legs before it can walk far enough to do permanent damage. That requires going closer to the Empire, Sarah said. Not away from it. Yes, Melis said. It does. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Be careful of what you carry, the old elder said finally, and the words had the texture of something she had learned the hard way. The more weight you accumulate, the better target you become. She was 2 days south of Cragen's Flat, riding hard on a route that Fenn had mapped through the lower highland terrain to avoid the roads where Asheville's tracking parties might still be operating, when the riders found her. Not Asheville riders. She smelled them before she saw them. Pack wolves, not fully shifted, moving fast through the tree line to the east. 5 of them. Then a 6th breaking from the north at an angle that said flanking, not attack. She pulled her horse to a stop with one hand already on the short blade and waited, because running from a coordinated approach was exactly as futile as it looked. The first rider who came out of the trees was not someone she knew. The second one was. He had changed. She noticed that first before she noticed anything else about the situation, the specific way Kaelin Draven had changed in 9 days, which was not the change of someone who had been managing a crisis from a throne room, but the change of someone who had been in the field. He was trail dirty, 3 days unshaven, wearing riding gear rather than court dress, and his horse was a Highland breed like hers, not a palace animal. He had come into the Highlands himself. He had not sent more trackers. He stopped his horse 12 feet from hers. She looked at him across 12 feet of cold Highland air, and she felt not what she expected to feel, not the clean anger she had been carrying since the pre-dawn room in Ferris territory, but something older and worse, the specific ache of a bond that was still technically intact and made its existence known at unwanted moments. The wolf in her chest pressed forward with a recognition that bypassed every decision she had made in the past 9 days and simply responded to his proximity the way a compass responds to north. She pushed it back. Not with violence. You couldn't fight your own wolf with violence. It only made the wolf more insistent. With direction. She gave it the image of the council circle, 9 elders with their hands raised, and the wolf settled, confused but contained. Kaelin looked at her with those gray eyes, and his jaw was tight, and his hands on the reins were the hands of a man exercising a great deal of control over himself. You look well, he said. She almost laughed. The inadequacy of it, the specific way it collapsed everything that had happened in 9 days into a social reflex, was almost funny from a distance. What do you want, Kaelin? He breathed in through his nose. I want to talk to you. You had 3 years to talk to me, she said. You chose a throne room ceremony instead. I've noted the preference. His jaw tightened further. Melis, you also sent 8 trackers into the Highlands with a riding formation designed to manage a detained subject, she said, which told me everything I needed to know about what kind of talking you had in mind. She held his eyes steadily. So I'll ask again. What do you want? He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, The Northern Border Alliance collapsed. I know, she said, because someone forged my correspondence and used it to advise the Northern Elders to dissolve their treaty arrangements. That someone was not me. Something shifted in his face. I know it wasn't you. That landed in a way she hadn't expected, and she let it land without reacting to it, because reacting was information, and she wasn't giving him information yet. "How long have you known?" she said. He looked away briefly. The tells were still the same, the slight avoidance when the answer was something he didn't want to account for. 4 days, he said. 4 days. He had known for 4 days that she had been framed, and he was here now, which meant he had spent 4 days deciding what to do about it before he came. She filed that away with the specificity of someone building a record. "The compact proclamation," she said. "You authorized that. It was presented to me as procedurally necessary. Did you read it before you authorized it?" she said. "Yes or no?" The silence was its own answer. "Celine presented it," he said. "Yes," Melis said. "She would have." She looked at him with the clearest eyes she had. "How long have you known that the forged correspondence came from inside the palace?" He looked at her directly. 4 days, he said again. "Same time." "And Celine?" He was quiet. "Kaylin." Her voice was flat. "Does she know that you know?" "No," he said. Something cold moved through her. "Then you came out here without telling her, without your guard complement, on a Highland horse instead of a palace animal." She breathed steadily. "You left Asheville without her knowing." "Yes." "Which means you think the palace isn't safe." He said nothing. His silence had always been a language, and she had always been fluent in it, and right now it was saying yes. She looked at the man she had bonded with 3 years ago, who had asked her to kneel in front of 300 people 8 days ago, who had known for 4 days that she had been framed and had come to find her in the Highlands on a horse that wouldn't be recognized as a palace animal. And she thought about what it cost a man like Kaylin Draven to be here, on this road, in this configuration. And she thought about what it meant that he had done it anyway. It did not change what he had done in the throne room. It did not repair the thing he had broken there. But it was data, and data was what she worked with now. "The warlords," she said. "The ones that have been testing the northern border for 2 seasons. Are they moving?" His eyes confirmed it before his voice did. 3 days ago, coordinated advance on the northern passes. It's not a raid. It's a structured invasion push." He paused. "They've been waiting for the border alliance to collapse." "Which collapsed on schedule," she said, "because it was engineered to." The implication settled between them in the cold air. She watched it settle in him. The specific moment when a man who has been managing crisis response understands that the crisis was not accidental, that someone inside his own walls had timed the border alliance's collapse to coincide with an external military threat, which meant the threat and the internal engineering were connected, which meant... "She opened the door for them," he said. Quiet. Certain. "Yes," Melis said. "She was never building an alliance for you. She was building a position for herself. The Varric military forces she brought into your framework. How integrated are they at this point?" His jaw worked. "Significantly," he said. "Enough that if Varric forces stood down during an invasion push, your border defense has a gap." He looked at her with gray eyes that had gone very still. She had seen that stillness in him before. It was the expression of a man processing information that changed the shape of the world he thought he was standing in, and doing it in real time, in the field, without the luxury of a council chamber or a night's sleep to absorb it. "She controls the gap," he said. "She controls the gap," Melis confirmed, "which means she can negotiate the invasion's terms from inside your own military command, which means whoever wins the battle at the northern passes, she wins the war for the throne." She held his eyes. "You said the palace isn't safe. What specifically are you afraid of?" He breathed out hard through his nose. 2 of my council members have been replaced in the past month. The appointments went through the standard procedure, but Celine managed the recommendation process. I didn't notice until... He stopped. "Until I started looking." "What made you start looking?" He looked at her. "You left," he said, simply, without defensive framing. She absorbed that and put it away and moved on, because this was not the moment for what it made her feel. "Kaylin, I have 9 outer territory settlements in formal coalition now, with Ferris Pack's endorsement. That is a network with real reach into the Highland territories and real relationships with the pack authorities the Northern elders will listen to. She kept her voice level and direct. I also have a full account of the forged correspondence, verifiable through the letter signatures and the timing inconsistencies in the document chain. I can get that account to the Northern elders fast enough to change their position on the border alliance, potentially fast enough to matter militarily. He looked at her, waiting. What I need, she said, is access to the communication channels I don't have. Direct contact with the Northern Pack Council, not through the network's runners, which are good but slow, through the Royal Courier line, which can reach the Northern Territories in a day. She met his eyes. I need your courier authorization, and I need it now, not after a council process. What you're describing is running a parallel diplomatic operation to the Crown's official position, he said. The Crown's official position got there via forged documents and a collapsing border alliance, she said. So yes, parallel is what we have. He looked at her for a long moment. She waited. She was good at waiting now. She had gotten better at it in 9 days than she had been in 3 years, because waiting inside the palace had always felt like defeat, and waiting out here was simply part of the work. The Northern military situation is going to break into full engagement within 48 hours, he said. Maybe less. I know, she said. That's why I said now. If I give you the courier authorization, he said, and you reach the Northern elders and the border alliance reestablishes, the Varric forces are still integrated into my defense structure. Celine is still inside the palace. He paused. The military situation is only one piece. Yes, she said. It is. What do we do about the other pieces? She looked at him steadily. He had said we. She registered it and neither accepted nor rejected it, held it at arm's length and examined it, because Kaelin's saying we had meant very different things at different moments in their history, and she was not the same person who had learned to parse those meanings. And the version of we that existed now was a practical thing, not a restored thing, and she needed him to know that. We stopped the invasion, she said, together, because that's the fastest way to do it, and the invasion is the immediate threat, and innocent people are in its path, and that matters regardless of what else is true. She paused. Everything after that, we handle separately. Celine's position, the council infiltration, the throne. She held his eyes. Separately. He understood what she was telling him. She could see it in the way his face absorbed it. Not with surprise, but with the specific look of a man who has been braced for something and has received it and finds that the reality of it, however hard, is cleaner than the anticipation. All right, he said. He reached into his riding coat and took out a sealed document, a blank authorization courier warrant, the kind a king carried in the field for situations that moved faster than messengers could. He held it out. She reached across the 12 feet between their horses and took it from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. She made sure of that. Not with cruelty, with precision. She looked at the warrant in her hand and thought about what it represented. The Crown's reach, its speed, its official channels. Everything she had walked away from. Everything she was using now on completely different terms, for completely different ends, with a completely different understanding of what authority actually was and where it actually came from. Then she looked up at the sky to the north, where the cloud cover had thickened and the temperature had dropped another degree in the past hour. And somewhere under that sky, the northern passes were filling with warlord forces that had timed their advance to the collapse of an alliance that a woman in Asheville had engineered from behind a throne that wasn't hers yet, and 800 people of the Ferris Pack, and 400 of Outer Crave, and 43 of Heron's Fold, and all the people of 9 other settlements she had visited in the past 8 days were standing in the path of what happened next. She tucked the warrant into her cloak. "Fan," she called. He came up from the tree line at a canter. She handed him the warrant. North Road. Full courier authorization. You know the message. He took it, looked at Kaelin, looked back at her. "How long do I have?" he said. "Ride like you don't," she said. He went. She turned back to Kaelin. "The northern pass at Grayfin," she said. "That's the choke point for the invasion route. If they get through Grayfin, the Highland settlements are exposed. Everything I've built in the past 9 days is in the path of that advance." "I know Grayfin," he said. "Then you know what holding it requires." She looked at him with eyes that were clear of everything except the work. Can you fight without your Varic forces? He held her gaze. Yes. Then we go to Greyfen, she said. We hold it until Fenn's message changes the Northern Elders' position and the Border Alliance reestablishes, at which point we have enough coordinated pack force to push the warlords back. She paused. We fight together. We hold together. And when it's done, we handle it separately, he said. We handle it separately, she confirmed. Around them, his 5 riders were watching. Her Highland horse was stamping at the cold ground, impatient in the way of horses that have been asked to stand still in cold weather longer than they find reasonable. The cloud on the peaks had descended another 100 feet while they had been talking, and the wind was picking up from the north with the specific edge of a storm building somewhere above the passes. She did not look at him again the way she had looked at him across those 12 feet when she first saw him. The unguarded look, the one that had surprised her with its own persistence. She had filed that away and closed the file. What was between them now was not personal. It was the specific gravity of 2 people who shared a situation so urgent that everything else had to be placed beneath it. Not because those other things didn't matter, but because right now this was what mattered. And in her experience, the people who tried to manage every dimension of a crisis simultaneously usually lost the dimension that was most immediately lethal. Greyfen was most immediately lethal. She turned her horse north. Keep up, she said to Kaelin Draven, and she rode. The passes ahead were full of what was coming, and somewhere in Ashvale, a woman who had planned for every contingency except this one was standing in a throne room built to make men feel small. And she did not yet know that the variable she had sent running into the Highlands was no longer running, was riding toward the worst of it instead, with the king she had humiliated at her flank and 9 settlements at her back, and the cold, hard knowledge of someone who has been to the bottom of what can be taken from them and has found, against every expectation, that the bottom holds, that it holds, and that what you build on bedrock is different from what you build on anything else. The storm hit as they reached the base of the Greyfen approach. Below the pass, visible even through the driving snow, the warlord advance had already committed its forward line. There was no time left. There was only this. The pass at Greyfen held 3 feet of new snow by the time the fighting stopped. It had lasted 11 hours. Melis knew this because she had counted the light, the gray storm light of the morning giving way to the flat white of midday, then contracting into the dim and final blue of early dark. And because her body had its own accounting of elapsed time, which presented itself now as a deep ache in her left shoulder where she had taken the hilt of a warlord blade in close quarters somewhere around the 7th hour, and as a cut along her right forearm that had stopped bleeding on its own and had dried to a dark line in the cold. She was sitting on a flat rock at the upper edge of the pass when it ended, not because she had chosen to sit, because her legs had made the decision for her, the way the body sometimes overrides volition when it has calculated more accurately than the mind that the immediate crisis has passed, and the accumulated cost of the past 11 hours is now being presented for payment. She sat, and she breathed, and she looked at the pass below her, where Kaelin's fighters and the pack volunteers who had come down from the Highland settlements. At the sound of the battle were moving through the snow, and she thought about nothing for a while, which was its own kind of luxury. The warlord advance had broken at the 9th hour, not because of what happened at the pass, though what happened at the pass had held the forward line longer than anyone had a right to expect from the numbers they were working with. It broke because Fenn's message had reached the Northern Pack Council in time, and the council had voted in the small hours of the morning to reinstate the Border Alliance. And when the warlord commanders received word that the eastern flank they had been counting on was no longer open, the strategic logic of the advance collapsed. An army that is committed to a pincer movement cannot simply pivot when one arm disappears. The forward line at Greyfen had kept pushing because that was what it was ordered to do, until the order changed, and then it stopped. The stopping was almost harder than the fighting because the body didn't know how to believe it yet. Melis breathed in the cold air and felt the ache in her shoulder settle into something she could live with. And she thought about Fen Varys, who had ridden through the night on a Highland horse with a courier warrant and a message that had needed to arrive, and had made it arrive. She thought about the Northern Elders who had received that message in the dark and read the account of the forged correspondence and chosen to believe it, which was not a small thing. It was the choice to trust an account that contradicted the official position, which required a specific kind of courage that didn't make noise but mattered as much as any of the fighting below. She thought about the 7-pack volunteers from Outer Crave who had come down the mountain into a military engagement they had no formal obligation to enter, because Devon had told them what was at stake, and they had made their own assessment and showed up anyway. One of them had a broken arm. 2 had injuries that would take weeks to heal. None of them had died, and she was going to carry the specific gratitude of that fact for the rest of her life, quietly, in the way you carry things that are too large for words. Kalen came up the slope toward her as the last light was going. He was in worse shape than she was, which she had not expected, and then, thinking about it, had understood. He had been in the thickest of the forward engagement for most of the middle hours, because that was what he did, had always done. The Alpha King who led from the front rather than the command position, which was both his most effective quality and the one most likely to get him killed. He had a gash above his left eye that had bled extravagantly and then dried. His riding gear was ruined. He moved up the slope with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body was also presenting its invoice. He stopped a few feet from the rock she was sitting on. They looked at each other in the failing light. "The advance is fully withdrawn," he said. "The Northern Council is holding the eastern passes." "I know," she said. "I could hear the line pulling back from the ridge." He nodded. He looked out over the pass at the work happening below in the snow. 6 dead, he said. Quiet. 12 seriously wounded. She absorbed that. The weight of it, 6 specific people who had come to this pass and would not leave it, was not the kind of thing you processed all at once. You took it in increments over days and weeks, and you carried each name when you learned it, and you did not put them down. "Do we have names yet?" she said. "We will by morning." She nodded. He stood there in the near dark, and she sat on the rock, and between them was the specific silence of people who have fought alongside each other and have not yet made the transition back to whatever they are when they are not fighting. That transition was always strange. In the fighting, everything simplified. The immediate threat, the immediate decision, the body's pure economy of survival. Outside it, the complexity came rushing back in, and the complexity between them was considerable. "I need to go back to Asheville," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "Celine is still there." "I know that too." "Melis." "Don't," she said. Not harshly, she was too tired for harshness. "Say what you're actually trying to say." He breathed out. The cloud of it hung briefly in the cold air. "I need to remove her from the throne, from the palace entirely. The council infiltration has to be addressed. The compact proclamation needs to be formally rescinded." He paused. "I need witnesses to all of it, people with standing who can't be dismissed as partisan." He looked at her steadily. "Your name carries weight with 11 outer territory settlements and the Ferris Pack. What you've built in 10 days it's real. It's recognized." He stopped. "Will you come back? As a witness?" She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the throne room, the 40 feet of marble, the 20-second silence. She thought about the woman she had been when she walked out of that room, and the woman she was now, sitting on a rock at the top of a mountain pass with dried blood on her forearm and 9 settled councils behind her. And she understood something that she had been approaching for 10 days without quite reaching, that the woman who had left was not inferior to the woman who had stayed would have been. She was not a story about someone who survived her own destruction. She was a story about someone who discovered, in the process of losing everything she had been assigned, what she actually was. That was not a lesson that fit back inside the palace walls. "Yes," she said, "as a witness, not as anything else." He held her gaze. "I understand." "Do you?" she said. Not as a challenge, genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. "I made a decision in the throne room," he said carefully, "that I told myself was about the alliance and the strategic necessity and the Empire's security. I told myself those things so completely that I stopped examining them." He looked at the snow below. "I think I had been telling myself things about us for long enough that I'd forgotten what was actually true, and it was easier to make a clean break than to sit with what I'd done to get there." He breathed in. That's not an excuse. I know what it is. She listened. She did not fill the silence with absolution, because absolution was not hers to give, and she had nothing to offer him in that direction anyway. What he was describing was his accounting to do, not hers. She had her own. I let things happen in that room that I should have looked at more carefully, she said finally. Not the kneeling. I couldn't have prevented that without information I didn't have. But before that, months before that, I saw the distance growing and I managed it instead of addressing it, because addressing it required a conversation I wasn't sure how to have, and managing it was something I was very good at. She looked at him. I'm very good at making things function despite what's wrong with them. That's useful until it isn't. He looked back at her. We were both managing, he said. Yes, she said. We were. The dark was almost complete now. Below, someone had lit fires at the edge of the pass, and the light of them moved in the wind, warm and unsteady against the white ground. She stood up from the rock, slowly, negotiating the various complaints from her shoulder and her back and her feet, which had been making their dissatisfaction known for several hours. In the morning, she said, we go back. They arrived at Asheville 2 days later, and the city they rode into was not the city she had left. She felt it before she saw any specific evidence of it. The quality of attention on the streets as the party came through the east gate, the way people stopped and looked with the particular alertness of a population that has been living inside uncertainty for long enough that the sight of its king returning from the field, battle-marked and trail-dirty, and accompanied by a woman who was not his queen, generated something more complex than simple relief. There was relief in it. There was also the specific watchfulness of people who have learned recently that the story they were told about who held power was not the whole story. The palace gates opened before they reached them. Celine Varick was in the great hall. She had arranged herself with the precision of someone who had known they were coming, which meant she had informants on the road and had used the time to prepare a position. She stood near the center of the hall, not on the throne dais. She had not, apparently, taken the step of sitting on the throne itself, which was either restraint or a calculation about optics, and with Celine it was always a calculation. She was dressed formally, white and gold, and her face was composed with the extraordinary control Melis had come to understand was the specific armor of someone whose survival depends on never being readable. She looked at Kaelin. She looked at Melis. She looked back at Kaelin. You found her, she said. The words were angled as relief, performed with precision. I found her, Kaelin said. His voice was quiet and entirely flat. I also found the courier chain that produced the forged correspondence. And the original draft of the compact proclamation with the revisions in your hand. The hall was not empty. There were council members present, guards, household staff who had not had reason to leave, the accumulated witnesses of a palace that had been waiting to see what came back through the gates. Celine had needed those witnesses to be here when she greeted the returning king. She had not needed them to be here for this. Her composure held. It was extraordinary how well it held. You're describing an accusation, she said, without substantiation. The substantiation is at this point in the hands of 7 outer territory settlements, the Ferris Pack Council, and the Northern Alliance elders, Melis said. She said it plainly, standing a step behind Kaelin's left shoulder, which was the position of a witness rather than a plaintiff. The forged letters were dated in a window when I was already 3 days' ride north of Asheville. The writing inconsistencies are specific and documentable. The seal approximation used materials sourced from the palace's own supply inventory. She looked at Celine. You prepared everything except for the possibility that I would turn around instead of keep running. Celine looked at her, and for the first time in the space of 2 or 3 seconds, the composure shifted. Not into guilt, into assessment. Pure rapid assessment, the mind running through variables and options and exits in the time it took to draw a breath. There were no exits. Kaelin said, The council will convene in the morning. You'll be given full opportunity to respond to the evidence presented. He paused. Tonight, you'll be confined to the East Wing. Celine looked at him for a moment. Then she said, You know this ends your alliance with House Varick. House Varick, Kaelin said, can decide whether it wants to be associated with what you did. That's their accounting, not mine." She said nothing further. The guards came forward, and she went with them with the uprightness of someone who has decided that the performance of dignity is the last available position and intends to hold it as long as possible. And the hall watched her go, and then the hall turned its attention back to its king. The council convened for 4 days. Maelis testified on the second day. She gave her account in the same plain sequential order she had given everything in the past 10 days. What she had observed, what she had inferred, what was documented evidence, and what was analytical conclusion, and where the line between them fell. She was precise about that line. Precision was the thing that made testimony worth anything. Without it, it was just feeling with a formal setting. On the 4th day, the council issued its findings. Selene Varick was stripped of her title and removed from the palace pending exile from the Empire's territories. The compact proclamation was formally rescinded. The forged correspondence was officially attributed to palace internal origin and the record corrected with the Northern Pack Council. Kaelin came to find her that evening in the small room she had been given in the guest wing. Not the Luna chambers she had quietly arranged for different accommodation, and nobody had argued with her about it. He knocked. She opened the door and looked at him. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood in the doorway. He was clean, which was the first time in several days she had seen him without field dirt or dried blood, and he looked like himself again. The Alpha King in his own palace, the composed exterior reestablished. And yet something was different from the version of himself she had seen in that exterior for 3 years, something she didn't immediately have a name for. He said, "I intend to resign the crown." She looked at him. "Not under pressure," he said quickly. "Not as a political move. I've been sitting with it for 4 days. He breathed in. What Selene was able to do, the council seats she filled, the instruments she was able to use, she used them because I created the conditions for it. I was looking at the borders and the alliances and the military capacity, and I was not looking at what was happening inside my own walls because I trusted that the inside was managed." He paused. "You managed it for 3 years. And when you were gone, there was nothing between the throne and someone who wanted to take it." He met her eyes. "That's not about Selene. That's about what I built and what I didn't." She thought about what to say and took her time with the thinking. "Resigning the crown doesn't fix what's broken," she said. "It just removes you from it." "I know," he said. "But the empire needs to be led by a council rather than a king. What you built in 10 days with 11 settlements, that's a better model, a distributed model, every pack with a voice in the decisions that affect it." He looked at her. "You know that's true." "Yes," she said. "I know it's true." "Then I want to make it formal," he said. "The Draven Empire cedes territorial authority over the Highland frontier. The Outer Territory Coalition gets formal legal recognition, and I step back from the throne to a border defense role because that is actually what I'm good at." He held her gaze. "I'm not good at the inside work. I never was. You were." She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him for a long, quiet moment. This was the thing about Kaelin Draven that had always been true and had always been the most difficult thing about him, that when he finally saw something clearly, he saw it completely. The problem was the amount of damage that had to happen before he looked. She thought about that, about the specific cost of the damage, about 6 names that Fen had given her that morning, the 6 who had not come down from Grayfen, and about the settlement at Terath's Edge 2 winters ago, and about a 24-year-old woman signing a document she should have read, and she thought, what is the fair price of seeing clearly, and who gets to decide when it's been paid? She didn't know. She suspected nobody knew. She suspected it was one of the questions that didn't have answers, only people making the best available choices in its shadow. "I'll present the Coalition's position on the formal recognition to the Council," she said. "The terms will be ours, not the Empire's." "Yes," he said. "The Highland settlements set their own levy structures. No external authority over pact territorial decisions." "Yes. And the border defense role you're describing. You report to the Joint Council, not the other way around." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She held his gaze. This was what was left between them. Not the bond, which was still technically there, but which she had made her peace with leaving in its strained and altered state, something that existed but no longer governed. Not the history, which was real but finished. What was left was this. Two people who had been through the worst of themselves and had come out the other side with a clear accounting of what they were and weren't, and who had in front of them the possibility of building something real on that accounting if they were honest enough to do it, not together, separately, but toward the same thing. "All right," she said. He nodded once. He turned to go, and then he stopped, and he stood in the corridor for a moment with his back to her, and she waited. "I'm sorry," he said. Not elaborated, not performed, just the words placed precisely in the quiet of the corridor. She thought about what they cost him, and she thought about what they were worth, and she thought about the distance between those two things. "I know," she said. He walked away down the corridor, and she closed the door, and she stood in the small room in the palace where she had never belonged, and felt the particular feeling of a chapter ending. Not with violence, not with triumph, but with the slow settling of things that have moved through turbulence and come to rest in a configuration that is different from where they began. You never fully felt the ending in the moment of it. You felt it in retrospect, in the quiet, in the absence of the noise that had been present for so long you'd stopped hearing it as noise. The quiet was here now. She sat down and looked at her hands, the healed cut on her forearm, the calluses from 10 days of riding, the frostbite scar on 2 fingers of her left hand from the night at Grayfen 2 winters ago. Hands that had signed documents she should have read and written letters that moved provisions across a frozen empire and held a short blade on a highland road at midnight. The hands of someone who had learned the difference between surviving inside a structure that was breaking her and building something that could hold. The formal recognition ceremony was held 6 weeks later in the open highland clearing at Cragen's flat, rather than in Asheville's throne room, because Malus had requested it, and the Joint Council had agreed, and because some agreements should be made in the places that made them possible, rather than in the places that made them official. 11 elders stood in a circle in the early spring light. The snow had retreated from the flat, and the ground was wet and dark, and smelled of the cold mud of high-altitude thaw. Sarah of the Ferris Pack stood at the circle's east position. Jenna Fold stood at the west. Davon Crave stood at the north, with his quiet level eyes and his scarred jaw, and the expression of a man watching something he had been building for 2 years become real. Malus stood in the center. She was not wearing anything formal. She had not brought ceremony clothes to Cragen's flat because she had not been thinking about ceremony when she packed, and then she had decided not to go back for them because the absence of ceremony clothes seemed correct for this particular moment. She wore the riding clothes she had worn for 10 days, cleaned and mended. She wore her boots. She wore no mark of office. The terms of the Outer Territory Federation were read aloud by the Council's designated speaker, a young woman from the High Craig settlement who had a voice that carried across the flat without effort. Equal representation for every affiliated settlement, joint decision-making on matters affecting shared territory. No external authority over internal pack governance. A shared defense protocol that obligated mutual support without obligating participation in conflicts outside the Federation's defined scope. And one additional term, proposed by Sarah and seconded by all 11 elders, written into the founding charter in the careful hand of the High Craig speaker, that the Federation's governance would be reviewed every 5 years by the full Council, because structures that cannot examine themselves are structures that cannot survive their own errors. When the reading was done, the elders signed. Malus signed last. Not as Luna, not as coalition advocate, which had been a working designation for an in-between time that was now over. She signed as the Federation's first appointed sovereign protector, a title the Council had created specifically that had no precedent in the Empire's records or the Pact Territory's histories, that meant exactly what the work had made it mean over 10 days in the Highlands, nothing more and nothing less. She looked at the signature for a moment after she made it. Then she looked up at the sky above Cragen's flat, which was the enormous blue of early spring at altitude, with the last of the winter clouds pulling back toward the northern peaks, and the sun coming in at a low angle that made the wet, dark ground of the clearing glitter faintly, and she thought about the night she had stood in the wolf yard of Ashevale Palace, with the celebration inside and the stars above her, and the cold air coming down off the highlands, and the slow, certain knowledge that something had gone out inside her that could not be relit. She had been right about that. The thing that went out that night had not been relit. She had built something different instead, not a restoration, not a return to the before. Something genuinely new, in the way that things built from the ground up after the old structure has come down are genuinely new. Rougher in places, without the elegance of what gets refined over generations, but truer to the ground it was built on, more honest about what it was for. Devon came to stand beside her as the elders dispersed into the small knots of conversation that followed formal moments. 11, he said. 11, she said. The two who declined at the first meeting have sent a preliminary inquiry. 13 by summer, he said. Maybe, she looked at the signed charter. Don't count them before they sign. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. When do you go back to Asheville? Next week, she said. The joint oversight session on the defense protocol. After that, she paused. Not for a while. There's a settlement 3 days east that's been dealing with a water rights dispute for 6 years that nobody with any legal knowledge has been willing to actually look at. She paused. I looked at it. The solution is not complicated. It just requires someone to sit down with both parties and explain why the complicated version they've each been using isn't actually supported by the governing framework. Devon looked at her. That's what you're going to do. That's what I'm going to do, she said. Sarah moved past her on the way to the clearing's edge, and the old elder paused and looked at her with those dark, settled eyes, and Melis looked back, and nothing passed between them that needed words, which was its own form of recognition. The clearing began to empty as the elders made their departures, back to the territories that needed them, back to the ordinary work of governance, which was not the dramatic thing, but was the real thing, the thing that determined whether the dramatic things had been worth their cost. Fen brought her horse around from the tree line where the animals had been tethered. She took the reins. The sun was halfway down from its peak now, and the shadows from the pines were beginning to stretch east, and the air was the specific combination of cold and light that the high altitude did in spring, where it felt like the season was still making up its mind but had privately decided. She thought about Kalen somewhere south, on a border road, doing the work his body and his particular kind of intelligence were suited for. She thought about what it cost a man like that to step back from what he had been born into, and she thought it had cost him everything, and she thought he had paid it, and she thought that was between him and the long remainder of his life to figure out what it meant. She thought about Celine Varick, exiled to the territories beyond the Eastern Reach, which were not comfortable territories, and she thought about what it must be to be Celine, to have planned so precisely, so long, and to have been undone by the specific variable she had designed the trap around, the variable who was supposed to run and had turned around instead. She thought, I hope she builds something real out there. I have no way to know if she will. But I hope it. That was as close to forgiveness as she had. It was not nothing. She mounted. Below the clearing, the Highland Road ran north and east into territory that was now, formally and legally, and with the signatures of 11 elders to prove it, the land of people who governed themselves. Fen was already on his horse, looking at her. East, he said. East, she said. She rode out of Craggan's Flat into the spring afternoon, and behind her the Highland clearing held the quiet of a place where something had been settled. Not everything, nothing is ever everything, but enough. The specific enough that means the foundation holds and the work can continue. And the wind came down off the mountains and moved through the pine trees with the long indifferent sound of a world that was proceeding regardless. And the road ran ahead of her into the territory she had claimed not by bloodline or force or ceremony, but by the oldest and most difficult method there was, by showing up over and over in the places where it mattered and doing the work. That was all. That had always been enough.